every time it's like the first time of how to technology.
Yeah, the blinking record button is very much the tell us a joke of poetry, right? Suddenly I can barely remember my name, let alone words.
So, this is episode 24. Yes, we have now completed 23 episodes of the past, which we have just on the epiphanimus of our birth, the anniversary of our first episode, which is Epiphany. We just did a week-long celebration and released 7 lost episodes and one that we just forgot to put out in a timely manner after it was recorded. So it wasn't really lost so much as just wandering. It
was right there. It was the Feast of Michaelmas, and I like to think, Michaelmas was kind of floating with its protective wings, waiting to.
You mean Ficklemas? Oh, yeah. So, So we are in an exceptionally proud of ourselves dopamine high of. We technically have all our old episodes out. There are 2 half episodes. There was 1 half episode, and now there are 2, which we have a plan to remedy, and I already have enacted half of said plans. So we are en route, as Pepe Le Pew might say. But it's exciting. It's exciting to be caught up in any aspect of my life.
Yeah, some of these go back to like 2017, the Feast of St. Mary of Egypt.
And Valentine was 2018. So yeah, I think it was just St. Mary of Egypt. And we do have, our half episodes are now Valentine. When we did recover said files and Mark was able to stitch the disparate sides of our Skype wormhole together, it turns out we only had the last hour. So stay tuned. There might be time travel involved.
Yeah, it was very fun to do the time travel stuff. That was great.
And we're time traveling right now because people don't know the hell we're talking about, which is fantastic.
Who makes a cult podcast to be understood?
That's right. Absolutely.
Speaking of time and podcasts, should we Sesame Street our themes for today?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Radio Free Golgotha. That's this thing we're doing right now, and we've done a bunch of them already. Thanks for joining us, whether it's the first or otherwise.
Did you ever stop to consider that if this is episode 24, we're averaging less than 4 episodes a year?
No. I want my dopamine. We're up to date. That's the important thing.
It is. Who doesn't remember 2017 like it was yesterday?
Right.
Right. Okay. Sorry. Please. Al, what's in store for us today?
What's in store today? Well, we're wishing everyone a very happy feast of St. Thomas Aquinas. That will be our patron saint and patron feast of this session. Our demon, just to aim big, is Ashtaroth, or Astaroth, or Ashtaroth, or Ashtaroth. We'll go through some of those wonderful permutations of nomenclature. Our plant is the mighty oak. Our stone is the Thunderstone. Our magic is the magic of the passions. You're playing well technically proficient, like passion. Our figure is Via, the way or the path. Sometimes the river, occasionally a bunch of other aliases, and it's correspondingly similarly shaped Meji of Ogbe, and our Major Arcana is the Empress, just to bring us on home. So we're very excited to be cracking into this, and very excited for you to be joining us with your ears, or indeed with, I don't know, if you've got speech to text things as well. That would also be pretty rad. I hope mine's in a cool font. I am Feld English.
Yeah. Memory kicking in of if you are new, hi, welcome. It will not get more organized or make more sense, I promise. We do have a webpage at www.radiofreegolgotha.com, which has the updated, consistent, all the record, the history, the syllabus of our errors.
A rapture.
Our rapture sheet. And in addition to this, it does provide links to YouTube. You can check us out there for any engagements that Al or I might be doing, talks that we're doing around the country or online gigs, if you're interested in hearing either of us babble more, or babble on, as it were. And there's also a Facebook group for those of you that are on the Liber AF, which is Folk Necromancy. Please answer the initial questions, because we are strict about the questions, the necessity of those answers. Like American Masonry, I don't think the majority of people understand what the group was created for, but that was deep. But the group's topic overall is, as Folk Necromancy, is looking at the various necromancies, both engaging with the dead, but also the kind of more early modern conception of demonology and the dead being in one classification to explore the invisible world and the folk applications of these things. So not always looking at just high magic, but how high magic might actually be used, as well as folk magic and folk engagements, as well as funerary practices and ancestral reverence and the various things that titillate our tits.
New tomb excavation just dropped, babe. Yeah. That's a very
And in addition to that, we are planning I would say, at least 2 more speakeasies this year, if not more.
Oh, yeah.
We are consistently talking about hosting them, but the Speakeasies of the Dead are a series of like an online informal conference of sort. It's more of a gathering in a salon atmosphere, exploring various topics that is on a base loose theme. We've done 4 of them so far, and we look forward to more, but these are all things that you can check out at our website and on our various pages. We're very bad at Twitter, but meaning I'm bad at Twitter and Al is non-existent on Twitter. So we'll try to announce these things, but this is the official boring part of trying to understand what the hell to say to make sure that we say who we are. So this too will get better, maybe pre-recorded in the future. Okay. This is, as Al has said, the January 28th feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, who is very there are a lot of topics that are a little intimidatingly broad, and not just like many of our topics are historical, but it's, as you were just saying, Al, the problem with Thomas Aquinas is he was a real person. So we don't just get like previous to the 3rd century pre-congregation adoration of a figure. We get a historical record from a prolific writer who is Thomas Aquinas is famous for his writings, and huge amounts of philosophy coming out of this Sicilian. And because he's 13th century, this is written history, and very well written history. It is having spent several hours trying to review my head of why I might like Thomas Aquinas. Let's be honest, this saint was chosen because it was near the end of January and allowed us and our sound engineers some time to get this episode out, perhaps on time. So, sorry, Thomas, you would not necessarily be my first choice, but you certainly are my choice today. And for that, thank you. He is sometimes called, in addition to Al, the good doctor or the angelic doctor, and Dr. Universalis, Dr. Communis. He's from the county of Aquino, so Thomas Aquinas in Italy, his ancestry. Big natural theologian. Some people say the most influential philosopher or thinker in the Middle Ages, in the medieval period, and the greatest of the medieval philosopher theologians. It's you either like him or you don't, but you can't deny the fact that he was prolific.
Right. Definitely considered one of the Catholic Church's greatest theologians and philosophers, right?
Yes. I don't think anybody's ever even been compared to him as far as the sheer amount of philosophy, but that time period also has the recovery of so much. This is the seeds of the Renaissance are being sown, right? And a lot of things that were formerly in like Greek philosophy, which had been deleted by the church, had been translated into Arabic. And because of the Moorish occupation of Spain and Spain's Castilian monarchs translating so many of the classical Eastern Mediterranean philosophical treatises, now the Christians are taking back this philosophy and forming new ideas with it based in their very much rooted in Christianity, and trying to rectify this great wisdom that came out of thousands of years of philosophy before them that is now, it's stirring some brains very strongly.
Yeah. The Christian monastic schools translating various scholastic, Islamic and Jewish philosophers and philosophies. And actually, most crucially, which is how I know Aquinas through doing some my doctoral work, is rediscovering the collected works of Aristotle, which I believe throughout Aquinas' career he just refers to as the philosopher over the time. And so, he's an influential philosopher and theologian. He's a doctor of the church. He's a Dominican friar, which his family is not too keen on initially. And he's very engaged with scholasticism, which is, the philosophical analysis, mostly based around the Aristotelian 10 categories, but in short, attempting to synthesize Aristotelian philosophy with principles of Christianity, particularly the Aristotelian metaphysics and its account of the primum mobile, with various Catholic notions of the Trinity in their theology, for instance. His best known works are the Disputed Questions on Truth, which he writes between 1256 and 1259, I believe. The Summa contra Gentiles, and I didn't realize it was unfinished because it's just so massively influential and just massively massive. The Summa Theologia, or Summa Theologica, which he writes between, or comes out between 1265 and 1274. And I'll be honest, that's the only one I've read in any depth. And even that with the heavy annotation of Robert Minor, who's an Aquinan scholar, particularly interested in the Passions, which we shall get to.
Yes. I do think the model of his Christian story is quite fascinating as far as a saint goes. Again, the family, another family. I don't mean like we've talked about it already, as in when I say again. But again, we see yet another person who wants to join an order, and their family is like, no, bad idea. In fact, so bad, we're going to lock you in a prison.
Right. We're gonna kidnap you. We're gonna family human traffic you back to the castle and keep you there. Right. Yeah. Okay. So let's go from the top. So we at least in terms of thinking about him as a philosopher and as a philosopher saint and things, it's worth talking about early and earliest education, which we're pretty sure is he's sent to the Monte Cassino, the abbey there at the age of 5. And then some war, military conflict, between Emperor Fred II and Pope Greg IX spills into the abbey around 1239. And so his parents, Landulf and Theodora, great names, have Thomas enrolled in the new university, the Studium Generale, which has been established in Naples by Frederick. And it's there that most historians argue that he's probably introduced to Aristotle, as well as Averroes, and of course our man Maimonides, who would all obviously influence his philosophy and his theology. But yes, right. So at the age of 19, he I haven't really encountered exactly what it is that's said to set it in his heart, but he resolves to join the Dominican order, which had only been founded 3 decades earlier. So it's still pretty. I wonder if that's one of the main reasons that that the family are not into it at all.
But that happens all the time. New orders and things like that. As long as the church has got it, I mean, there's no difference to me. I don't know. Maybe that was it. Maybe no, we're a Cistercian family. But it's like colleges and Yale and Harvard. But I'm not sure. The one note that I thought was fun to just muse on, this kind of glossed over, but his teacher in almost all the things he studied at the academy was an Irishman. And we don't often hear in a nod to the scholastics of Ireland in the medieval period. They are there. There's many scholars, but Peter of Ireland was the one who is said to have taught him arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, logic, natural philosophy. And this is fascinating. But, he gets swept away by this idea of the Dominican order and the OP, as they're known, the Order of Preachers. And, Dominic is his own. every order has their certain feel to them. But his family is pissed off, and they think they moved to Rome and then Paris. And
yeah, the Dominicans are arranging to kind of like shell game him out of it because his Theodora has a bunch of like influence, various spots to try and get him back, and so he's on the road to Rome, and per his mom's instructions, his brothers like bum rush him, supposedly while he's drinking from a stream, I believe, or a spring, and then they take him back to the castle at Monte San Giovanni Campano. And he spends like a year being held prisoner there, all the while being like, nope, as soon as I get out, I'm off to the Dominicans.
And I think they hire a prostitute. Well, I know they do, at least according to the record. I was not there. I was that prostitute. But they hire a prostitute to seduce him. And he drove her away with a log from the fireplace. And so this becomes a subject of many paintings and artworks. And there's a famous one where angels are actually wrapping him in a cloak of chastity after he returns said burning log to the fire after having chased away the harlot.
Right. He's said to have inscribed a cross onto the wall with it and then fallen into a mystical ecstasy. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And he won, here's the quote. Behold, we gird thee by command of God with the girdle of chastity, which henceforth will never be imperiled. What human strength cannot obtain is now bestowed upon thee as a celestial gift. And so he was given the grace of perfect chastity, which as Catholic school echoes in my ears, I remember the very strong admonition that chastity does not mean celibacy. And there is a difference, but it does mean correct sexuality. So if you are not married, then you would not engage in sexual acts. It doesn't, it's that type of thing of being chaste means that you are being pure for the allotment that you are. And so I think it's just, it's not so much the sex that's the problem. It's that he's not married to the harlot.
It's honoring your agreements and
yes.
and sexual integrity of sorts, I guess. Being an ethical slutty priest.
Yes, absolutely.
So he says, get behind me, slutty Satan. And the girdle is apparently it's a girdle sometimes as well as a cloak, right? And it's it's now in Chieri, apparently near Turin. I don't know much more about that. It's when we get to it, when we get to talking about his canonization, there's some interesting points about the fact that the 28 is actually the translation of his bones, which I love. Another one. I think saints are translations. It makes me very happy. So the other thing that makes me really happy about looking at Thomas Aquinas is, of course, he went to Cologne. Of course, he hangs out with Albertus Magnus, with Big Al. Yeah. So he's sent off to study at the Faculty of Arts at Paris. Which is where he's likely meeting another Dominican scholar, right? Albert the who's then chair of theology at the College of St. James. And that is it, right? Yeah. So when Albertus gets a promotion to teach at the new Studium Generale at Cologne in 1248, it seems Thomas goes with him basically, and actually declines an offer to be abbot at Monte Cassino as a Dominican, which is a nice little, that's where he's kind of first went to school, but he doesn't want to go back to his alma mater. He wants to push forward to this exciting hotbed of church doctoring on the Rhine that is Cologne at the time.
Well, that's an interesting theme in his life in general, right? I think I kind of project backwards upon why his family might not want him to join the Dominicans. So they want him to use his intellectual gifts to better the family and to bring renown to the family. So he's going to not bring wealth to the family, bring wealth to the church now, or to his order. And similarly, that's the Pope that offered him that job, which kind of says go back and teach young people, please. Teach them this amazing thing you're doing. And he's like, I need to keep learning. Sorry, I need to do my own work. I'm not focused on teaching other people. I'll write and go from there. Or at least that's what I project.
Yeah, no, the central tension in the Universitat, right? Of are we a research institute or are we a teaching institute? Because those are not always the same thing.
No, not at all.
Yes. I was going to say, we get the first sense of what he's like, kind of his personality a little bit coming through with Albertus talking about he was apparently very quiet and didn't speak much, and some of the other students in Cologne kind of assumed he was a little simple or wasn't really doing very much. And yes, there's a wonderful quote attributed to Albertus Magnus, right? You call him the dumb ox, but in his teaching, he will one day produce such a bellowing that it will be heard throughout the world.
Which of course brings up the tetramorphic cherubim and gospel imagery of the taurine bull. It's interesting too. I remember talking about similar lives of saints with friends. It's easy to kind of say that, because they all learned Latin, that they all speak each other's language. And that's certainly true that it helped. But there was a great deal of ridicule that when you went from, say, a Sicilian or Italian Latin all the way to Germany, which pronounced Latin very differently, because Church Latin had not been created yet. So Latin was pronounced regionally differently, and languages were evolving around the difference in those pronunciations. So Latin could be understood universally when written, but not as much when spoken. And there's record of this too, that in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, because the Empire of Rome is long gone, that Latin has evolved so much and certain people are taking certain words different ways and regionalisms, that the dialects of Latin are very difficult for people to understand. And I think about that with him going to Cologne. And I'm sure there was, he's speaking many languages at that point, but it's also the difficulty, or I think about that and what it must be to like your accents kind of muddled attitude of someone who's, oh, how cute.
Yeah. And the long-standing cultural thing of the supposedly civilized North Italian regions and peoples very much looking down their nose as well as down the boot at Southern Italians. If we count Sicily as fully Italian.
Sicily, Spain. Like that's a whole other Spain and Africa.
But I was going to say, with delicious Moorish influenced food. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is also, the cultural exchange between, or just continuum between Spain, Northern Africa, Sicily, Naples, is not to be underestimated. And that there is this wonderful thing of the Renaissance, yes, being founded in this Florentine attitude of Northern Italy, but like the seeds of it were for several hundred years beforehand, and it's not out of the blue. And certainly Aquinas is undoubtedly a prominent figure in the pre-Renaissance to allow these things to come into play.
Yeah, absolutely. There's sometimes a sense that like Aristotelian scholasticism is kind of blamed as the like, oh, it's a bunch of book nerds that don't actually go out, and it's often contrasted to the later Renaissance empiricism of like go and count how many legs the animal has, rather than just going to Aristotle and being like flies have 4 legs or flies have like however many legs they're said to have had. But the other aspect of the wider kind of like monastic scholasticism is exactly, it's like it's building the methodologies to be able to integrate a bunch of these older pagan ideas along with some very like for the time forward thinking Christian notions, and again sources as wide as like I think a lot about like Maimonides in that context as well, of like, I'm not saying magic isn't real. I'm just saying let's not be idiots about it.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's interesting it lays the groundwork too for the attitudes of because of increased trade during this time period, with shipbuilding and things like this. There's such an influx. There's huge explorations into Africa during this. It's starting, and we see the setup for 2 centuries down the line for New World, and what happens when Old World comes into contact with a quote unquote civilized New World peoples is to say that, well, they must have had a visit from Jesus. They must be Christians, and they have been led astray by the demons that are portrayed for masquerading as their gods. And that's the way of saying like, wow, they have their shit together. They're just not Christian. And this is a common theme, and I see some of that groundwork laid in that is there in the suggestion of how do we rectify this excellent pagan philosophy within a Christian framework. And it's, we take what's good because that was always true. Right. This type of thing of like, are we laying the groundwork for this idea of the harrowing of hell, which it's lovely to remember that harrowing means breaking the soil, because it becomes something, it has several connotations, but that harrowing itself is the act of when the plow breaks the soil, and the harrowing of hell itself of the good pagans, as well as the patriarchs and the Jews that were living an exemplary life that are, in that first outer layer of hell called limbo, that this becomes the groundwork. There's something similar there that I've seen in this idea of how do we approach pagan works? How do we, give credit to these people that we're encountering that have things that we might want? How do we rectify the past with our invented history? What coming at odds here. And Thomas Aquinas spends millions of words describing such.
Yeah, I think very much of like how the Prisca Theologia, this concept of like God transmitting truth back in the day, and that what we then have is a catastrophist understanding of remembering and forgetting various aspects of it, along with like, Tower of Babel and like prismatically splitting off that truth into lots of little bits of part of the truth, which you can think of absolutely as like that harrowing as like as saving those quote good pagans / colonizing other people's dead, but also trying to seek a through line through all of that stuff. And also, I'm always here a little bit for history that acknowledges that things are not a steady positivist increase of knowledge, that knowledge has to be articulated and re-expressed. It can't just sit there. Has to, otherwise it's a use it or lose it kind of situation.
Absolutely. And I think in this transmission and even in building upon this idea of the conversion of these great knowledges into something that is acceptable and therefore true in the world, because for it to be real, it must be brought into the fold of the church. And in this way, the church is the new, center of the universe, the Vatican specifically, but that he does turn over to teaching, right? Because he's researches enough at enough point, but specifically the Summa Theologica is aimed to be a beginner's text.
Yes.
It is the milk you feed to infants, as it were.
It also has a bunch of that stuff that you'll see later on, which is both of trying to go a little bit from first principles, a little bit, very very much like that. Is that meme I saw recently? Something like someone saying like, houses have windows and cars have windows, and houses stay still, so it can't be the windows that make a car stand still because to make a house stand still, because cars have windows too. So it can't be the windows that make the car go. And someone being like, this is exactly what ancient Greek philosophy is like. Category stuff. As well as the like, the sheer caucasity of like Rene Descartes stoned out of his mind, crawling into an oven and being like, okay, so I think, all right, and therefore I am. Let's go from like, what is to think, what is cogito, etc. Right? The desire to build things up from very first principles is kind of in some cases there, but it's also, still 13th century. And so there's still a lot of like, well, obviously as God has done this, like, then let's move on from what we do about it, which is again, where Aquinas and his stuff on the passions kind of starts to get into ethics as well as just kind of like psychology, for want of a better term. So his remains, that's why he's the 28th of January, his feast, because they're translated from Fossanova to the Church of the Jacobins in Toulouse on the 28th of January, 1369. Nice. And then they're held there for a little bit. And then in like 1974, for a little while in the 18th century, up to the 20th, actually, they're held in the Basilica de Saint-Senin in Toulouse, and then in 74 they returned to the Church of the Jacobins. And when he's canonized, his feast day is inserted into the general Roman calendar on the 7th of March, which is the actual day of his death. So he's not a saint that's his feast isn't his death day, but apparently since this falls like within Lent by V2's 1969 revision, right? His memorial is moved to the 20th of January. He's also honoured in some churches of the Anglican communion, apparently with a lesser festival on the 28th. Oh, and then that final thing about his canonization as well, that I maybe didn't realize that devil's advocate is like an official like position and not just like a phrase. That's really cool. Yeah, the devil's avocado is canonization.
The devil's avocado.
Yeah, that's great.
Yes.
He's only edible for like, a fraction of a moment. And then he becomes too mushy. He objects. There's an argument that like he shouldn't be canonized because he hasn't made miracles. And apparently one of his cardinals responds that, there are as many miracles in his life as articles in his Summa, which is like, that's how highly regarded his writing is.
Yeah, I mean, it was 50 years after his death, which for that time period is pretty quick for someone that a lot of people knew. Like usually you have a better chance of making it if no one knows you and they can just attribute miracles to you. But he was also said to be miraculous in the sense that he levitated. He levitated while studying. He levitated while praying. And he was said to levitate in ecstasy repeatedly. People would walk in on him and see him, and he would just like slowly come back down and be like, you didn't see anything. Now, is that like a description for the ecstasy he feels when like thinking and because that's been told too. But I think there's something beautiful to the scholar, the philosopher, Dr. Five, if you want to, he's the fifth, you named the fifth doctor of the church.
I think I'm going to Tia Davison actually.
But so and I also love there's the connection to that one church that's an Isium, Maria Sopra Minerva, in Rome, which has a lot of famous relics in it, but it's a Dominican church now, and we brought it up before for some sake because there's relics there. But that is in Rome, was eventually, he taught there for a bit because had just been given to the Dominicans, but also later on in time, it became the headquarters of the Thomas Aquinas College that was established a couple hundred years after his death. So I love that this church or this place that was held to be the college of Thomas Aquinas is also itself a translation of ancient sites, as many churches are. But this one is famously like the seat of Isis worship, and was mistakenly felt to be Minerva, but it was not. And like full on obelisks and things. And going there, this site is incredibly sacred. There is a Serapeum there as well. So Isis and Serapis being brought back by Roman soldiers and then going up. But again, the irony that his college must be housed in a place that is also itself a translation is quite beautiful. And there's also a lot of now the church add-ons that were done in the mid 15th century is Torquemada. So we're talking like huge center of Inquisition. So there's a lot of stuff going on at this church. So I guess Aquinas is interesting in that we're talking about what is he prayed to for? He's the patron of academics. Yes, against storms and lightning and this type of thing, but like he's the patron of academies, schools, universities, chastity, yes, or sticking to your guns, your goals very strongly. But all scholars, students, philosophers, theologians are under his patronage. And of course, patronage is not an official thing. It is listed in many books, but the saint himself can be gone to for any petition. It's just that when you do your dial a saint type of Catholicism, which is very Roman inheritance, right? Of like, well, what do I need to do? Well, I need to go to this saint to make sure I get the plow in shape. And I go to this saint to make sure the windows are still sliding. But also from the worker perspective, I find it fascinating. What would it be to go to this saint for everything? What does an Aquinian marriage look like? What does an Aquinian please don't let me go bankrupt look like? How does this saint, if there's this tapping into this current, how would this saint be like academically talking to you? Like in response, would this saint like deliver a letter explaining why he could not help you? I think about these things far more than I should. Because this is a thing we've talked about. The theme many times in folk magic is, knowing the local patron saint of your town is helpful. Right. That, you don't just ignore, there's the personal cult of the home. For sure. You have family saints, name saints, things like this. Some saints that you just feel an affinity for and you gather, a worship for, a reverence for, veneration, venereal. Why aren't those the same thing? But that if this saint is the patron saint of your town, then you would be going to this saint for everything. This is who would be assisting with the intercessions at mass, as well as the saint of the day, which I do enjoy that kind of Catholic notion, which I think sets us up very strongly in magical thinking in general, when the magical circles have seasonal names or time of the day names that must be altered, or that type of thing. Because in addition to a patron saint of a church, then this patron saint of the day is also being invoked through mass, as well as someone's funeral is being said. So they might invoke that person's name saint or the saint that's similar to their name, and ask. All of those things are intersecting in this time-space prayer that is specific to that moment and wholly specific to that moment, which I think is quite beautiful in the intense coded circles of the Heptameron and other schools. But just the idea of the same magical circle does not suffice all the time. It does not.
Boots on the ground, right? Like what's present at the moment, like what planet is ruling the day, what saint's miraculous life from the golden legend is being read that week at church. Like, yeah, exactly. Yeah. You're again having to engage with the world in doing this kind of, even these very pious magics, right? There is a world out there. It's not just you and a spirit or some spirits or you and God. There's a whole mess of things to traipse through and to wait for the right wave on.
I also think it's worth pointing out that as I stare at my Dante and Beatrice bookends that I just bought, that he's in the Divine Comedy.
Oh, yes.
Yes, he's in the Heaven of the Sun and that's not unique to him. Like many other religious elders are in the Heaven of the Sun.
Yeah.
But the glorified soul is there. And I think that's a lovely understanding of the role of priests as being solar, and philosophers as shining light onto things, but also a unique solar connection for Thomas Aquinas, perhaps, to like, I like when literature or anything, a contemporaneous clue as to what a planetary inscription might be. Because in kind of focusing recently and looking a lot at correspondences and things, as articles and things need to be written, our notions of things change. And I find it very interesting when people, like the random thing of like bringing how hyena can be used for any planet because it can be justified to any planet. But we know that the hyena doesn't change its sex anymore. We know that the females just have a large clitoral proboscis that looks like a penis. But that is the reason that it was mercurial, was because it changed sexes. Right. And yet, do we still use hyena for Mercury then? Or like, do we put ourselves in a 14th century framework and think, well, it was used once, so it can be used again? Or does that invoke the glorious dead that we are inviting to our consecration to be like, I use hyena, right? See? Like, you thought this was real. I don't believe in it, but you do, and I want it here for that reason. Right. Or is it just like, I don't want to use it because it's no longer makes sense to me. And I'm going to use, a piece of rock that actually is from the planet Mercury that I spent, $900 on eBay. Right. And that is what I use instead. Like, I wonder, for me, that list of justifications or anything, what is this? Because it is wonderful compartmentalization when you go into like depth of not only the authors, but like Reddit and Yahoo groups, archives and things. They're like, wow, we can justify anything.
Well, I also can't, like, that's also not like, just a modern, arrogance or delight. It's
no, I
can't imagine that like Israel Heibner, writing at the end of the 17th century, doing an awful lot of, on the one hand, very much that like, Baconian astrology asana, sane astrology, sensible astrology, none of this superstitious stuff, but is super into building really accurate stopwatches and clocks so that he can make more precise astrological sigils, right? And he's literally folding in cutting edge telemetry of like from selenographia of like the most accurate lenses ground to get the topologies of like the moon and the planets. He's using images of the physical planets in like deep sky objects in his talismans that also have the cameo of the moon on the other side, right? Like, I can't imagine Israel Heibner, if he could get hold of moon rock, wouldn't be using it.
Well, absolutely. Even if you just said it was moon rock, if we can convince him that the moon is made of rock, what is it? He hit his head on a tree, and this kind of revived an ongoing illness that he had, Thomas specifically, and escorted to Monte Cassino to convalesce. And like many patients, he was a bad patient, supposedly. He just would get up and go again. And like, sit, you need to rest. And he's like, no, I got to do that. things. He'd already had his reputation kind of damaged for quite some time. Or at least it was starting more and more. And it was still, after his death where his heaviest critics, like they waited till after he was dead, like, because they knew that he could counter everything that they said more than likely, which is always fascinating. And that'll remind me of something I'll say in a minute. But, so he goes and they nurse him. He goes out he stops at another abbey and he falls ill there. Like he's just not doing well. And the monks, and he's only in his late 40s. And the monks nurse him for several days. And after he received last rites, he prayed, "I've written and taught much about this very holy body and all the other sacraments in the faith of Christ and about the Holy Roman Church, to whose correction I expose and submit everything I have written." So basically he dedicated his life to the church and said, the church owns me, the faith owns me. And, it feels a little bit like, when he says, "To whose correction I expose and submit everything I have written," is if there's error, because it's starting to come up that people are finding error with his writing, that he leaves it for the church to correct. And that he, I will not die in contempt of the church type of thing.
Yeah.
Which is apparently was, lovely Catholic kind of nailed down the throat here. And I have heard an Anglican say that this is one of the discussions as to why Thomas Aquinas can't be too major, is because part of our Apocrypha as Catholics, right, is the Song of Songs. And this is what Thomas Aquinas died giving commentary on. He was quoting from and expounding upon the beauty of the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon. So this is, a beautiful piece, but is also an ecstatic, somewhat sexual piece as well. So Josinho de Gomea was a Brazilian who rose to prominence and was kind of called one of, like, how they name people king of witches. He was one of the kings of Candomblé in the 70s. And he got initiated in two different streams. He was first made in a kind of, we say Candomblé Angola, but it's really more like Candomblé Caboclo. It fused with spiritism across the board. So it wasn't just focusing on the Inkisi, it was focusing on spirits, what would be called Exu Catiços, or Exu Compargida, as well as Caboclos and things like that. So it was like a heavy Umbanda, but very ritualized and still very African. And then he came and got initiated in Candomblé Ketu as well, which is more Yoruba based, and rose to prominence. He was also one of the people who started certain traditions. Like at that time, men did not dress as, even if they had a female Orisha possessing them, they did not dress as a woman when the Orisha came down. And because Josinho was gay, he had no problem with this. And he mounted both the equivalent, I believe, I'll say this, I don't remember which belongs to which nation, but he mounted both an Oshosi or like deity and an Oya like deity. One might be one might have been a Kisi, one might have been Orisha, but he mounted those two prominently. And when his Oya, it may have been Matamba, I'm not sure, came down, they would dress him fully as her. And this got him a lot of flack. But he was loved by the people that talked to him because he accepted everything. It wasn't just strict Orisha. It was like, "Oh, you have this spirit, then how do we help you develop it? How do we keep this thing going?" And heavily critiqued in his life, but he would always fire back. He was a little bit sassy. And there was some controversy, yes, upon his death about who the Terreiro goes to, because this is always a problem. But one of his primary students, someone lost a big thing and, name called and stuff. And she's like, "Shut your mouths. None of you dared come for him when he was alive. None of you did. So you have no ability to come for him now. Your words mean nothing."
Yeah.
And she's respected, but I find that interesting of like, what is it like when it's not the vultures coming out. It's like it's the body's folded in the ground and now you're going to critique. I never liked them anyway. Okay. Right. You can say that when you're alive. Like really, what is it? You were so like, you liked him when he was alive. You were at every feast he was at. And now, so it's not the prophet in their own house, but it is something like that, right? Of my house and my food are good for you when I'm alive, but afterwards you tell everyone that you hated me. Interesting.
Right. It's a very uncharitable attitude, right? As opposed to this notion of like, if the dialectic is truly about arguing towards a greater truth, then surely you should have raised these issues at the time. If they were realistic and weren't just about your positioning yourself. Right.
Absolutely. If it wasn't about ego, it would be something different.
But the fact that you're afraid to say that until he's gone. Yeah. Interesting.
On the only other like lesser side Orisha note is that This is interestingly given as one of the saints for one of the avatars of Babalué, known as Dasoyi, who is an elder or father of that Babalué nation in Cuba. And I find that fascinating because no one knows why those inscriptions are made sometimes. But as a doctor of the church, it's like, does someone just misinterpret doctor here? I'm confused.
That's what I do too.
But yeah, so who knows? And doctor, of course, does mean different things in different areas, right? Like doctor has a connotation of being the fix-it, not just the healer.
Yeah.
But like, so Aquinas is always an interesting one. And, is up there with Augustine and other church doctors. I mean, like, as I said, doctor number 5, much to the chagrin of the other doctor followers. Well, great. I think that's pretty comprehensive for the problem is he was very broad. Like, there's so much more you can talk about with him and you can quote all day long. But thank you. That was lovely to pitter patter off of each other. I think taking that theme of lust because I almost want to bring it up then, but I didn't want to sidetrack myself too much, of sending a prostitute is in an act of aggression to tempt your brother away from the priesthood. It's
Not
such
that
a weird thing because
not that,
but like, yeah, like it's such an interesting idea it's aggressive. It is an act of quote unquote war because you're using a strategy, right, to try and do this thing, and then using sexuality and trying to tempt him in that way. And it speaks to our demon. In lovely multiplicities of ways. And I think it's fascinating to pair Aquinas with Ashtaroth, because Ashtaroth is very well known for being very philosophical and as well as being, if we're going to talk about the translation of pagan things to Christian things, and the Isium to Maria Sopra Minerva, and Aquinas taking pagan theology and translating it to Christian theology to translate what is believed to be Astarte into Ashtaroth as a demon is also such a hotbed of not controversy, but dialogue and continued dialogue since it has been more easy to talk publicly about demons, which I don't know what that time period is, but the internet certainly helped.
Right. From one spilling of much ink on philosophy and theology to a counterpart in demonological circles. Yeah, because it's the go-to example on the one hand of arguing that certain not just demonic spirits, but spirits that have been demonized, right, have been denigrated, have been blackened.
The gods of the old become the demons of the new philosophy.
Yes.
Which is a little oversimplistic, and we talk about that too.
Absolutely.
That's a little oversimplistic. But go on. This is a prime example of such possibility.
Yeah, this is the main, I would say, maybe only example that's usually cited. It's not I wouldn't say it's the only example that exists, but we're pretty sure that Ashtaroth is a strange and possibly deliberately derogatory framing of the preeminent goddess mentioned in the Bible, the Canaanite goddess of Ashtaroth, supposedly based off the 2nd millennium BC Phoenician goddess Astarte. And apparently the deliberate corruption, the corruption might be deliberate. Astarte or Ashtaroth is meant to supposedly conform to a vocalization of the word bullshit, of shame, right? There's a shame bell being rung around Astarte to form Ashtaroth. And of course the plural, the Hebrew plural Ashtaroth, is a generic term for goddesses, used often with like Lord and Lords, as in Baal and
like
Lim.
Yeah.
Collective terms.
Exactly.
So you see that. Yeah, I went through some of the Bibli examples. You see it in Judges, in the 2nd chapter when they talk about Baal and Ashtaroth. You see it in the 1st book of Samuel as well, where they talk about strange gods and Ashtaroth, and later Baalim and Ashtaroth. So you get the sense of goddesses becoming demon as well as a single. And then we zoom forward to the start of the kind of bits of Grimoire record, at least by its own account, the Book of Abramelin, purportedly written around the 1450s. We have Ashtaroth as a male demon, and an important one, one of the main 4 at that point. So from there, we get some pretty typical examples of the Vea's entry in the Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonorum that Scott mostly recapitulates in Discovery of Witchcraft, that we then eventually get to the Lemegeton, which is one of the better examples. But also worth pointing out just how important Ashtaroth is within demonic hierarchies, whether it's the classic triumvirate of Hell's rulers with Lucifer and Beelzebub, or Beelzebub as the great Duke of Hell, and we get the Grimoire Verum and the Grand Grimoire talking about that. I've got some points about earlier manuscript forms from the Verum family about when Ashtaroth isn't Ashtaroth but is, as well as important demon of the week in the Grimoire of Pope Honorius, as well as one of the cardinal ruling demons in the Hygromantia, right, which is also one of the earliest literally and also figuratively Byzantine texts that makes its way into probably Italy and then to the wider sense. I got a bunch of stuff we can talk about with Ashtaroth.
Absolutely. Look, Ashtaroth is one of the demons that I remember not only just from early Biblit and being precocious Catholic child and wondering what this was, because I remember watching those direct to VHS. I'm old. Videos in Catholic school that were showing the worship of Baal and the many Ashtaroth that were there. They were always shaped like an Inanna figure, that was or curiously like a Venus of Willendorf in some of those movies of just the plurality of the female body. But also a couple of things, because I remember Ashtaroth, the sorcerer, of, when we're talking about the wonderful magic for substitutionary locomotion and Triguna Macoides Tricorum Sadistii from Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
Yes.
So that is the star of Ashtaroth. And God bless Miss Eglantine Price, or the devil bless her, whatever it is. But Ashtaroth seems to find ways into popular culture more than many other demons. And I think also of I know that there's many examples from pop culture. It's whether it's Pyewacket or it's the Devil a Daughter or Blood Ties and things like and there's also just the what is it, Black Widow's song "Come to the Sabbath," and that whole album has Ashtaroth things. But come to the Sabbath, Satan's there. Then they invoke it. And it gets very cheery after that. It's great. That whole album is fantastic. Even on that album, while it's talking about Satan and the devil, there's this conflation because of the time period when that album was made of understanding this kind of reemergence of or reinvention of, or all of those things of paganism and witchcraft, post-Gardnerian influence of understanding that there's love, sex, death are common themes, and this notion of Ashtaroth or Astarte being more Venusian, and perhaps giving rise to the cult of Aphrodite itself and merging the Cypriot goddess, but then also the adoption, therefore, of a lineage to Venus, which gets, more female deities of love and flow, the flow of the blood, the flow of semen, the flow of milk, the flow of sweat, all those things that happen that make a saltwater goddess suddenly become, the deity of that everybody wants to fall in love with or is in love with by their nature, thinking even there too. I don't know if I can think about Venus without thinking about Baron Munchausen and Uma Thurman, but also the discussion about Inanna and her possible synchronization with Astarte, which many people now argue is not actually as sound in the sense that yes, they were syncretized, but Inanna is more war than she is sex, and Astarte becomes more sex than she is war. And somewhere in the middle there lies a conglomerate that infuses with the overlay of demonization and the shame that goes with, see what I did there? Of love and sex going on there to form this modern idea of Ashtaroth is fascinating. And also the eternal debate, and I say eternal because it's not one that I don't think anyone that I know that tells me certainly that Ashtaroth is male or they're female, I don't believe. And it's not that I've experienced all sides of any demon, or I'm not saying that my experiences or trusted friends' experiences are the only ones. This demon seems to like playing on all sides of the gender spectrum. And very happily, to the point of, I think, although we're talking Ashtaroth, that in the equivalencies or the demonic synchronizations with Kimbanda, this is given to Rei das Sete Encruzilhadas, so the king of the seven crossroads. However, Astarte is given to Rainha das Sete Encruzilhadas, to the queen of the seven crossroads. And there is an argument that they're really talking about the same thing, right? By the time we're talking about Ashtaroth versus Astarte, because they synchronize, whoever did the demonic list for the Pombagiras tends to incorporate more female pagan deities than they do demons. And that might be the fact that all demons are considered male by many of the classic demonologists, unless you're in France, apparently. So I find that fascinating. I also find the interchangeability and the options of the king and queen of the crossroads as being a set pair, a polarized pair, where the queen is in fact much more like what we would think of a warrior king. And the king is much more passive and observant in his personality. Very, very, both amazing spirits, but also their temperaments don't match their gender assignments in Kimbanda as well as many other things, because this idea of male active, aggressive, and female seductive, and not passive in any way, but just a difference between aggression versus seduction or sensuality that is there in the older polarizations, as well as in reading up of realizing, of course, that it's in the Dictionary International. So that's Clancy, right? Yeah, so Clancy. I'm from the Midwest today. Ashtaroth is depicted as a nude man with feathered wings, wearing a crown, holding a serpent in one hand, and riding a beast with dragon-like wings and a serpent-like tail. Now, yes, that's very similar to the kind of, in fact, it's the basis of the not woodcut, but illustrations that we see that are popularized and are lovely. But it's not so much the illustration that gets me, but that description. And then looking at statues of the king of the seven crossroads from the 60s onward, of him being a very stately man. He's not overly muscular like some Eshus are. He's more tall and slender, but he has dragon-like wings, and he has a serpent tail, notably, that comes onto his leg from behind. And he holds a cup and a serpent. Right. Or he holds at least a serpent. Like, it's just interesting. Or the cup with the serpent going around it, which is both a symbol for poison and for antidote, right? So it's an interesting conflation there, that this description somehow obviously influenced some artist to make what became one of the standard images. And because of the King of Seven Crossroads being conflated with this demon, which is one of the big three, Grand Grimoire, Grimoire and Verum-wise, and therefore becomes like the red current in Kimbanda that is, but the king and the queen kind of exchange, depending on lineage, both of them can head that whole idea of crossroads. And I just love that this description. I was like, that's just describing the Eshu statue right there. Somebody was obviously looking at this description.
The pseudo monarchia deminorum. Yeah, he cometh forth in the shape of a foul angel, sitting upon an infernal dragon and carrying in his right hand a viper. Yeah, exactly.
And then, or wearing a crown, and the statue, like, not very few Eshus are depicted in a crown. King of the Seven Crossroads is almost always now, especially when you go into Image in the Bahia and Raíces Africanas, which are two of the main statue companies, depict him with a crown, sometimes with wings, sometimes without, but the serpent tail will come into play. And it's fascinating, especially on the windows, those that you see in like some of the old temples in Rio that are like 3 and 4 foot tall. You're like, is that another, why is everybody have wings? No, but a lot of them have wings, and that just picture of a serpent tail coming around. Does he have goat feet or not? Those subtleties determine what those Eshus looked like when they were made, which came first eventually, until you realize, like, okay, those statues were made at post synchronization with demons, post creation of, and I hate to say it this way, but the post the creation of what we would call Kimbanda now, because the roots go further back than that, of course. But as far as the recognition of being, a left-hand expression of these things codified onto Umbanda and dividing everything into like, the neat spiritism package and the demonic practices coming in there. Of course, these roots are far older, but what we know is still a 20th century, like, bottleneck of influences coming together that they again projected forward. And now through the advent of the internet and popularization and commerce, that it's also now unbraiding, and people are choosing different streams from that to choose and be like, no, I like to do it like this. And we've always done it like this. And we do it like, okay, sure. That's the same thing as do it the way you were taught, transmit what you were taught, and also allow for personal innovation.
Yeah.
That said, it's all very seductive and all very warlike. Ashtaroth.
Right.
Yes.
Around the I don't want to say switching, but the fluidity between male and female, and also the fact that like it's the Sejin Christiades. Like I find it fascinating that Ashtaroth is placed as the chief demon of Wednesday in the Grimoire of Pope Honorius, the day the Adams.
Why not both?
That the circle is a big old like mercurial glyph, right? Which a lot of alchemy influence is going to talk about the rebus and the the balancing or the transmogrification of the hermaphrodite and things like that. So that's along with Mercury in its and Hermes in his far darting nature, covering where two roads meet each other, or two or more roads meet each other. I find that super fascinating. The other angle I was going to mention is just how American Ashtaroth is as well, which again, if we're talking about like quote New World, is really interesting to me. And looking at this, seeing how it's phrased differently, we sometimes look to family of manuscript of the things that will become the Grimorium Verum and find this division of the triumvirate of hell of the LBA of Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Ashtaroth as dividing not just hell, but the earth itself. It said the inferiors of Lucifer are in Europe and Asia and obey him. Beelzebub lives in Africa and Ashtaroth inhabits America. Right? So with the account of Ashtaroth...
Oh, sorry, that was a dumb laugh. It was just exciting.
We have Ashtaroth inhabiting America. We also have the idea that Ashtaroth's servants are in America. The Grimoire of Pope Honorius refers to Ashtaroth as a count, and that his subjects dwell in the Americas, right? We also have the older notion in the Hygromantia that Ashtaroth is just the ruler of the West, of the four who have the first thrones among demons come from the four parts of the world. So the West itself being, from the old world, these Americas again. When we start to look at earlier manuscripts of the Verum of like Clavicula Solomonis de Secretis, and even some earlier, like 4667, for instance, we have a slightly different name for a start, which is, again, most of those earlier manuscripts don't have Ashtaroth, they have Elestor. Which in one case it's Clestor, but I think we can be pretty clear that's probably a typo, who has that very phallic sigil that we were looking at the other day, which incidentally also contains glyphs of, expressing again, like typically feminized and typically masculinated Moon and Mars. But the longer description of Elestor gives way more about America, along with this like bizarre chimeric description of their nose that is like 2 yards long and is like wrapped around their belly like a belt. That he kills many Americans when he hits with it, or he does not kill them; they are knocked down dying. And it said just a little bit afterwards in the Clavicula Solomonis de Secretis that if you forget to give sacrifice, your work will be ineffectual. And in America, Elestor could nearly overwhelm you with his blows. So there's this sense here that this spirit, which is almost certainly either a different name, an earlier name, not in terms of how do I frame this, whether or not we are dealing with a principal demon who is usurped by Ashtaroth, or if it's one of Ashtaroth's aliases. We have this idea that they're very present in the Americas in various ways, which I find really, really fascinating. That you're dividing up the world and a sense of like, having spoken to a couple practitioners who, are from Europe and so mostly work with Lucifer, moving to the States and working with Ashtaroth more in that model is fascinating to me. The only other thing I wanted to mention about that kind of stuff was the connection not only to crossroads and to a male-female fluidity, is also the concept of rulership, of sovereignty, of the matters of kings and lords. Because the main thing that say, Verum says about Ashtaroth, becomes very, very terse. Ashtaroth appears black in human shape. Honorius says of him that he gives favor of kings and lords. We know the operation on Wednesday to talk to Ashtaroth should be performed at a particular time between 10 and 11 o'clock at night. And it's done in order to obtain the good grace of kings, princes, and other powerful men of the earth. And it's also said that if you want to do this, you should also give the spirit a pile of gold. And I'm a little bit like, if you have a pile of gold, why do you think I'm summoning you? And then the king appears in the guise of the spirit appears in the guise of a king. And in some other versions of that, it also specifies emperors, which I find interesting. And that's also the title that Lucifer is given most commonly in these demonologies. And so there's this sense that Ashtaroth is also about not just the changing at the crossroads, but the authority to stand there and pick a path and block others and all that, wonderful stuff.
Ashtaroth is also one of the co-signers with Gandier.
Yes.
And the pact, the famous pact.
Yeah.
When
the nuns of Loudun, the possession case. Yeah. Ashtaroth is mentioned as a co-signatory. Along with Paris.
Similarly, in Marlowe's Faustus, which is far more boring than Goethe's. Goethe's is wonderful, but Marlowe tried. But is one of the three demons summoned by Faustus in Marlowe's Faust.
They go and attack Benvolio, right?
Yeah. I also you remember Ashtar or Ashtar Shiran?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there was a UFO contactee, George Van Tassel, in 1952, who started channeling Lord Ashtar, who was an extraterrestrial being or group of beings that many people now have channeled. And this is all in my homeland of California, in the Mojave Desert. I'm not from the Mojave Desert, but this is where this took place. And it actually, there was a whole center there in the Mojave Desert, but he claimed to receive telepathic communication from an extraterrestrial interdimensional being named Ashtar. This became the first, quote, metaphysical superstar of the flying saucer age. And he did his own kind of translation, Van Tassel, of like converting the Christian Bible to understand as an understanding of extraterrestrial intervention. And there's a lot of things going there. But what often happens, I directly compare it to kind of the thing that happened between Gardnerian and Alexandrian Wicca, that like Gardnerian, which is a term given by Bowers, right? But still, the Gardnerians have this pseudo-historical myth, big emphasis on the pseudo-historical, it being a contiguous fertility Murrayist, kind of fulfilling the prophecies of Murray. But that allows Alexanders to plagiarize a Gardnerian book of shadows and say that his grandmother initiated him through sexual magic at the age of 12, when the Gardnerian book of shadows had not been compiled yet. But because of the myth, the public face, you can't contest it. So I find that a fascinating foray into understanding how tropes and how memes take off, right? Things can take off very quickly. And once you put it out there, you don't know what people are going to do with it. When you write a book or an essay or a post, it has a life of its own now. You can tend to it and kind of corral it, but it's not under your control.
It's now in the mythic, and other people can in various ways and articulate it and rearticulate it in various ways. Yeah, but it also has a like, it's specifically like Ashtar Command has this interesting like historic reflection on the historicity in terms of like both Astarte and Inanna being worshipped in relation to the evening star, right? So again, we get this notion of like things in the sky,
and then so what happens is he gets popularized. He's channeling these messages and establishes a channeling center to talk to Ashtar Command. And there are other people getting messages from Ashtar now. And he doesn't like that other people are getting messages from Ashtar. He won't validate them. So other people break away and, form a splinter group, which is actually what gets called Ashtar Command. But it went from being this whole concept to the splinter group. But it is quite interesting that there is, all the way up through the 90s and this kind of new age spiritist gloss over it. it also is something, big to speak on that is subject of many of our friends' research areas of the overlap between what would be called the Fae and aliens and stars and all of these things, which gets controversial in the kind of nostalgic magical community because they don't want to conflate sci-fi with what they're doing. And in the argument, and it's admittedly a very difficult mind journey to go from the way our ancestors practiced, they were always aliens, and some of them argue the Jacques Vallée thing, they're all the same thing. They're all others that we can't see and they're worth studying, and seeing how these things interact. But when I first heard about Lord Ashtar, I was like, this is a little a prominent being that's manipulating a bunch of people into forming a new religion around them, and they kind of become the rock star of this movement. This feels wonderfully Ashtarothian. So go Ashtar.
There's a final angle on, well, not final necessarily, but there's another angle on the serpentine and draconic kind of stuff going on with earlier representations of the form Ashtaroth cometh forth in, and is holding and things like that, which is I think is attributed back to Sebastian Michaelis, who's the Inquisitor in Avignon during the 1580s, and he does a lot of classification of demonology stuff. And one of there are two things that they say about Ashtaroth that I found interesting. The first, the serpentine thing, is that Michaelis assigns Saint Bartholomew as especially effective at restraining the demon Ashtaroth.
Excellent.
Right, the saint that sheds his skin or is flayed, is carrying his skin, is said to be particularly good at dealing with this also quite serpentine, very very powerful demon. And I know many folks love Bart as a witching saint as well,
or fear Bart as a witching saint.
Right. The other wider thing is that Michaelis assigns Ashtaroth as a demon of the first hierarchy who seduces, but specifically seduces by means of laziness, self-doubt, and rationalized philosophies. Which no demonologist has ever been prey to. Not ever, not one.
You're reminding me about how you're saying Ashtaroth is assigned to America. That Astarte is often assigned to Europe. And kind of becomes like a Europa figure, and riding the bull and everything. And I don't know, it's something interesting. I know that another fascination for me, as far as icons, if you're not familiar with the Dama de Elche, the Spanish figure that was unearthed not too long ago, but and was felt to be a forgery at first because it was just, they didn't understand what it was. But it's a female bust that has large wheels, ornaments on the side of her head with beautifully ornamented hair with beads. It's a beautiful sculpture. I mean, it was discovered right at the turn of the last century. So in late 1890s, and maybe 4th century BC, Iberian. So mainland Spain. Wow. And what we're dealing with there is interesting because they're trying to understand who this is, what this figure is. And there's other figures that are similar, where there's these giant wheels on the side of the woman's head, which are ornaments that are popular from Northern Africa. And specifically, we're dealing with the cult of Astarte and Tanit. So Tanit is the city goddess of Carthage, who's almost always worshipped alongside Astarte. And so there's this kind of double Venusian influence going on here. You have the Lady of Guardamar and the Lady of Bassa, which are also wheel-bearing ladies in that way. I also saw an interesting, couple of interesting things with her. There was a whole resurgence in the last few years because they went in and analyzed the trace amounts of color that were left on the statue. So they're able to show how brightly, garishly colored marble statues were, which is lovely when you can do that. Just like the Met was doing something similar, showing you what statues were painted through projection, through lights. That we associate things with this pristine marble, but they were painted heavily. And similarly, also there's at least 2 or 3 drawings / illustration, full size, where they kind of use the Dama de Elche as a Hecate, because those wheels kind of give a natural thing of just being able to draw another face on the side of it. but this kind of ornate, kind of orientalized. Truthfully, it's an Orientalist approach of just like it looks other, and because it can't be placed, therefore it's appropriate for something like trying to rewild Hecate. Because I think that that's been part of the kind of Hecate revival of since the late 70s, early 80s onward, of constantly trying to de-Anglo the Greek gods and not make them just as pristine things in marble togas, but to understand that like Greece is oriental to Rome and was compelled to be a savage version. They were savage. They were barbarians compared to the Romans, and especially the Asia Minor Greeks. That's a whole other thing.
Yeah, goddesses and demonized goddesses and deified demonic ladies of the night who are in their essence regarded as even to the Greeks regarded as like foreign, right? The Thessalian one and all that business, right?
Yeah. And of course, bringing it back to Hecate, who is another one who is by some authors associated with this Ashtaroth. So it's all whatever it is you want it to be, which I both stand by and abhor that I said that.
So the from this like often literally blackened, right? Especially by the time that Ashtaroth is a big, powerful, not just a man in black, but a man of black, to the fecund earth represented in Venusian, fertility and abundance that we find in the typical readings of the Empress, Major Arcana. So again, we deal with like not just a often pregnant, but also a rulership of a ruling motherly force with a scepter and a diadem of 12 stars, and again comparisons to a high priestess. This not necessarily just a duality, but this sense of both the worldly and creative output of the Empress and the ascetic and wisdom keeping capacities of the high priestess. So again, the typical keywords associated with the Empress are often in many like tarot handbooks are about femininity, nature, abundance, sometimes beauty, sometimes nurturing, and then therefore the reversal indicating some kind of creative block, as well as rather than a sovereignty, a dependence on others.
Yeah, there seems to be a big conflation between the Empress and Mother Nature. In that way, as the one who presides over growing things, the 12 stars being the 12 months, and the presiding over the year, the rulership, and therefore is a lovely permutation on Venus herself as being more than just sex or attraction, but being the force that makes pregnancy and brings pregnancy to term and makes you care for your children so that you raise them so that your children can then also find a mate and all these. But this continuation of generation and generations of love, of what is that, lack of universal. But the Empress also is interesting because I always think about with the obvious, not only the astrological Venus, but that it is often conflated to like this Aphrodite, spreading out frothiness that's with her, that's in contrast to the Emperor. But we're still talking about rulership. And there's kind of this two figures that bring up a third for me, which is weirdly a somehow in state combination. But one is Queen Victoria, who was, literally declared Empress in Delhi. And for the time period of these cards could not be far from the mind of anybody as far as long ruling female monarch and what that means. And she's not overly sexualized in any way, shape or form, Victoria, except, wedding dresses are white now because of her. But the notion of an Empress that is Victoria, and then the childlike Empress from Neverending Story is the other side of it, of this eternal being that you can't tell how old she is, but she looks like a child. And what there's a certain strangeness in that, but that she knows the secrets of the universe, but also retains an innocence, or at least, but not a naivete. And that's an interesting polarity there of somewhere in the middle of those two, because maybe it's the paleness of the childlike Empress, which he names with his mother's name in the story, that she needs a name. And then the kind of Queen Victoria, who of course I think more of in the elder years, because that's when I see more photographs of her rather than the younger years.
again, the Aquino is who becomes blackened as well.
Yes.
And Albert passes like infamously a long period of mourning, and the grieving mother, and all of those like attendants of Dolorosa Adorata kind of
which a lot of that projection of the Virgin brings me to the third figure that they invoke and put together, which is Elizabeth I. Very strongly of making a choice and very much manipulating the public eye and image to replace the Virgin Mary in the newly Protestant nation of like project upon your queen all those things as the empire grows, as we gain wealth, as we somehow don't go to war with everybody that we should be going to war with, or at least we survive the small wars that are created. And this is there's something interesting in looking at these female monarchs that are here, because there's still the Empress in the tarot still betrays a very Western European notion of what a female ruler or a woman in power is, which is, the tarot is ultimately a European expression informed by its own ancestries and things like that. But it's not going to, what is it going to be if you see Zinga here? What is it going to be if you saw Lady Six, the Mayan ruler? They're here, but they're not. They're curiously, there would have to be a difference in whole symbol sets to make it work. But the Empress is, I don't know, it's interesting because in pairing her with the High Priestess, does she have the same amount of power? Is she she's after the Emperor, but I don't know.
There's almost a parallel there, I feel like, between, again, that notion of like, to return to the Aquinan, like of the research and the fermenting of wisdom keeping, and the teaching and the passing on and the transmission and reception of the output of that stuff. In the two of them. I'm still kind of like, I chewing on this notion of like empresses or Liz one of Elizabeth I in this role, because it's fascinating because she's Virginia, right? So she's both she's the colonizing and literally naming a plot in these northern Americas, as well as the queen who is potent and like the notion of like virgin materia. That contains all of this potential, as well as mother to her peoples.
Where the empire itself becomes the stand-in for her lack of generation as a person, and where the conflation, therefore, of the empire and the Empress as one thing, that by people doing their work, they impregnate the empire and therefore populate the world. And I'm my head there because I can hear it in my head and I'm going to hear the critique. The Empress is after the High Priestess is what I meant to say, that the Emperor comes after. And I think about that in the terms of the kind of quote unquote evolution of the Fool. And what does that mean to go from Magician to High Priestess to Empress, and then to Emperor, Hierophant, and then Lovers, where the two sides are kind of rectified. And I'm not sure what it is for the Empress to turn into the Emperor, because it makes it feel like the Empress is after the Emperor, quote unquote, of being subservient to him. Or secondary to him, and I've never liked that feeling.
No,
personally,
I think it's the Promethea tarot issue where they're framing the Fool as like the Big Bang, and that the Empress is the literal Earth, and then the Emperor is the rules of things like gravity that allow. But one of them is the land and the life itself, and the other is the conditions that keep a sky over your head, and that kind of thing.
Well, it's very interesting too, just the contrast between the cards. So that we see with the High Priestess, okay, there's the pomegranates behind, and there's columns, so there's the temple. But the Empress herself, she's on possibly a bench or some type of chair, but it's soft. It's covered in pillows and velvets. And, there's that heart shield there, but she herself is viewed to be comfortable, or made with, and she's wearing so much cloth, which is fecund, but therefore is not practical either. She's meant to be sitting in state. Or to be, the billowing cloth. It's not, this is not practical. This is drag. And then by the time we get to the Emperor, it's almost like all that beautiful green growing thing has gone away, and the Aries martial throne has, put itself down,
But it's also the Earth and its relation to the stars that then allows the first zodiacal sign, both like in terms of Aries as at the top of the year, the astrological year, but also I think the first zodiacal attribution to that sequence of the majors, right?
Well, what's the warmth? The whole arguing for a tropical astrological system, but what's the warmth that's needed to start the year out of darkness?
Yeah.
The wet earth that has now been received the snow melt that is Piscean, and we're this moving forward.
I was looking at the card again and was struck by not just the meadow that she's in the kind of foreground, which is again very sort of pastoral, very like the flowers of the field, the lily of the field, right? Consider the lily. And that also makes me think if we're talking about Elizabeth I, of like the kind of Spencerian notion of the fairy queen as well, of like
yes,
the meadows of Laetitia in the Fourth and things like that. So there's that element. But the thing I was going to say was I was struck by, I never give enough credit when she comes up to the waterfall in the background, the churning waters pouring forth. That this isn't just idyllic nature. This isn't just chocolate box pastoral. This is also like an outpouring, as well as like this phlegmatic dynamo of this thundering of water onto earth, and
that's to have this like weird association with the shift from Pisces to Aries, which is not what we're kind of talking about that, but like the earth itself being the wet earth, the moist earth, the black earth of the waters of creation issuing forth. It definitely reminds me of Krull and pulling fire from water. But the glaive also, but pulling fire from water in that marriage, right? And how many childhood hours were spent trying to pull fire out of water in a pool. But this idea of like the Aries fire is born from the black moisture of the year before. It's fascinating. The Empress is, I don't think it's not as a mysterious card as much, right? Like it's some readers will take it to mean female authority, whereas others will easily say like the emperor can come up as for a woman in power. That is, it's not just about male versus female, but about authority versus generation, or especially in this case, building off of mentioning monarchs. I don't think you can separate the empire from the Empress. If her connection to the land is almost Arthurian, or just it's almost a Fraserian connection between the ruler and the land in a way that is different from the emperor, who is more aggressive and ruling and doesn't feel as innately connected to the land as much, at least the Rider Waite.
Right. The emperor issues decrees like about the land and on the land. Whereas the Empress is a little more of the land. I'm struck always in looking for Eden again, that this is also said to sometimes be by like Waite and things like an earthly paradise that she's in. And so there's this Edenic thing to it as well, of like a perfected state, and a sense of putting forward a possible return to that in some way.
Yeah. I think, going over Waite's descriptions, including the clandestine and doubt and ignorance that can come in with this, or in the reverse to an unraveling of involved matters, or vacillation. And I wonder, those keywords are actually not as common in little white books for more modern decks, which is interesting. But that there is a gestation that is associated here, right? When we're talking about length of days and the understanding of the cycles of nature, that to have fruitfulness, one must build up to fruitfulness. You reap the harvest of your work.
Right.
And that, the unknown, doubt, the ignorance can also be like, we don't necessarily know what's going to be fruitful. We have to help nurture that. The gestation is an important time, which is done in the dark. Gestation is always done in the dark. And there is an ignorance that goes with that. We don't know what the empire is planning. We're just good citizens who chop wood and carry water. So, okay. Speaking of the gestation and darkness, I guess where I'm going with that is, mighty oaks from acorns type of.
The image of natural authority and strength, kind of bridges those two. Yeah, the mighty oak, the royal oak, in some cases. Yeah. Let's. There are a couple angles that, as we've been talking, I've been thinking, oh, that's something to peg with oakness, right? So, I got very excited when you recommended the Archie Miles, the British oak, book. Yeah, compendious information about the national tree. And while there's an awful lot of royalism to it, it also brings up the interplay of myth and folklore and history present in in the oaks, in the understanding of the oak as the tree of the Druids.
So Druid, yeah.
The word deriving from an oak tree, that they are the oak people, or the ones with oak wisdom, and those kinds of things. But also that, again, our accounts of them are, as we've talked about a couple of times when it comes to the Druids, are all pretty much pulled from Roman sources, right? Specifically, often like Pliny the Elder, from where we get the mistletoe and some of the white robes that we also get with a lot of the 19th century interests in them, and the which itself parallels the kind of like 17th century refound interest in them from Aubrey and the rediscovery of Stonehenge, because England is old enough to leave things lying around and forget that they're there for a couple hundred years.
Yeah. Oak is such an interesting plant because it was the first thing that made me hyper aware of some difference between old world and new, because the things that we call oak trees in California are live oaks. It's a type of oak, but it has a much smaller leaf, and its leaves curl under and they're pokey. Like if you step on them, they hurt your feet. And I remember being barefoot and you're like, oh, it kind of hurts, but it's not terrible. But like, and the foothills of Los Angeles are dotted with them. I went to a school that was, before I went to Catholic school, was named for the oak trees on the property, and playing in, 200, 300-year-old fallen oaks and oaks everywhere. There's a huge one on my parents' property where I grew up. Almost everybody has a live oak tree somewhere in their yard in my hometown. And then hearing all these things, of like, and seeing a drawing of an oak leaf, I was like, what is that? And I remember it was like 5 and feeling very lied to, of like, we're calling, none of this is making sense. And my dad being like, well, these are live oaks. This is what's native to this area. It was like, but looks nothing like, I know it has acorns, and I know it gives gall, which is great because that's fun little things you can throw at people or make cursing ink out of. But I remember that distinct difference. The oak tree made me aware of a lack of consistent truth, which is ironic, right? Given that oak tree is such a tree of truth. And it's made me pay attention very closely to the different types of oaks. There's, if I remember correctly, like close to almost short of 200 like New World oak species alone. And just the conflation of, if it's not a white oak, it's probably a red oak. And like red oak doesn't mean a specific tree. And part of that is because, Linnaeus only gives 5 New World species. And like, so everybody's just trying to figure out like, which one of the 5 is it? Like based on leaf shape. And you're like, well, okay. So,
right. Moving here and someone pointing out an oak and being like, but that looks like an oak designed by Tim Burton. It's all spiked, as opposed to my nice grown-up-kin rounded edges of the silver. Right. Yeah.
And I remember I used to teach in Jersey a lot. So there was a lot of pin oaks. Most of them were pin oaks. And here in the Hudson Valley, I'm seeing tons of turkey oaks, which is just interesting to see these tiny, slightly different, the turkey oak here is considered a weed tree. Like it's a weed. The tree is classified as a weed. Is fascinating to me. And this reverence for the mighty oak in other traditions, the oaks of Thor or the oak tree of Guernica, or, just the English oak itself, right? Like it's, what a beautiful tree that is, it adds many more species that it's just, there's no universal symbolism, and yet there's a universal symbolism. Yeah. Go on with what else? Sorry.
No, fascinating. I mean, we got another link back to, some version of a god lord or a lord god of Baal or Bel, or Yule, right? Of the Yule log is meant to be a solid, good piece of oak. You get Christina Hole in her British folk customs of in the 70s, saying the Yule log was the domestic counterpart of the great communal fires of the midwinter and midsummer festivals. And like them, it was associated with fertility and continuing life and with preservation from evil. And then, yes, of course, we get, Royal Oak Day cropping up around the 29th of May. That's originally seems to be popularized in 1660 with Charles II's return to the throne, where everyone wears an oak leaf in celebration of a king hiding in a tree. And this is also, a fascinating piece of monarchists' propaganda in terms of linking to already a national tree to also a bunch of like other late May, linking the late May to the early May of like, of Green Men and Jack in the Greens and May Queens and this kind of thing. So getting the start with the older look to the past, and then the end of May as the look to the embodiment of that in the head of the nation, wearing the crown.
The shift from things that were considered low class now become high class because they're harder to manufacture in a big way. But like acorn flour, which is very common in indigenous diet in North America for sure. You have to leach the tannins out because otherwise you're just going to vomit. Oak leaves themselves are actually poisonous to livestock in large amounts because of the tannins. And I also remember being told, oak tree is struck 5 times more than any other tree by lightning. And that specifically is because it has the highest iron content of most trees. So it's natural that then the tree itself will draw the attention of the thunder gods who will come back later.
Yeah, and hence iron gall ink as well.
Absolutely. I mean, oak gall is very interesting because we call them oak apples. Like I didn't grow up calling them gall. I thought that was always interesting. Found out later, like, oh, I got plenty of them. But it's for those who are familiar, it's a growth formed by the gall wasp. It's the tree's reaction to a parasitic relationship with the gall wasp, and they're very light, like not quite styrofoam lightness, but pretty close. And then you can boil them and they make things black, or you can grind them down. But it's they're fun to throw at people because they don't hurt.
They're the nerves of tree projectile.
Yeah, absolutely. All I can hear is Morgan Freeman saying "damned English oak" in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, which was a reaction to the door being thick. So oak. As far as other personal associations with it, like because I lived in San Sebastian for a while, and cities around there, Lusaka. The oak tree of Guernica is a huge thing. And if you're not familiar with Guernica, you might be more familiar with Picasso's painting of it, which the famous thing is that when the Nazis invaded his studio, they looked at him and looked at the painting and said, "Did you do that?" And he pointed to them and said, "No, you did that." So Guernica in the northern area, it's in Vizcaya, which is in Spain, the Basque provinces. There's 7 total, but Vizcaya and Guipúzcoa are on the northern shore. So you get Bilbao is a city in Vizcaya. So Guernica has a tradition of an oak tree there where the local rulers would take oaths under it, swearing by the oak tree. And part of this is the relationship between people think between the word truth, or the word for word rather, and the word for oak, eats and not eats. But that to stand under the oak tree was you're swearing. This was like swearing on a Bible. And then we go back to at least the 9th century, the Lords of Biscay swearing under this tree, which is also, I found out, just an ancestor, one of the first Lords of Biscay. But because this tree symbolized an autonomy, the Basques would ask the Spanish king to come and swear under the tree that he would protect their autonomy and allow them to uphold what was called the Formuac, the old laws. And so the tree became a symbol of autonomous pride within the Basque identity. And because Franco was trying to unify the country in this beautiful fascistic banner, he told the Nazis that they could start their bomb practice on the little Basque shopping town of Guernica and, aimed for the oak tree, as it were. So it's the original survived, but, what they do is they cultivate a new tree, 50 feet away from the old one. They either take an acorn so it's contiguous. These trees that have grown. There's a newer one now. It's always sad when the old one dies. But the Nazis came, and it was April 25th or 26th, 1937. And it was they were practicing for what they would do to England, and how they would do a bombing raid. So the oak tree of Guernica is, it's one of the more famous oak trees there. So it's also the symbol of the town, like the tree in front of the small place where the Lords met. That is a, Roman-esque building. It looks like a little Parthenon. But that was the Luftwaffe. And then you get Picasso's rendering of that with the horse going off to the left, just huge, giant things going on there. So you can see it in, I think it's Museo Reina Sofia is the actual place where it's housed, which is in Madrid. Anyway, there's that. And then I think also can't remember, it might be Fraser, Sir James Fraser, of the offense of a German if they break a living oak tree's twig. It was given that they should staple, meaning put a nail through their intestines, which they are pulling out of their belly, and then to walk around the tree until they pass out dead, out of offense for having felled part of an oak tree or an oak in a sacred grove. I can't remember which it is, but I just remember that thing of like, okay, so I have offended the oak tree. So the honorable thing to do is to staple a piece of metal to it with my intestines and offer my body to it in forgiveness.
It's a heck of an apology.
Yeah. And then you get the St. Boniface, right? The cutting down of the oak tree of Thor's oak or Donar's oak, and then putting a St. Peter church right on top of it, which is fascinating because if you're a tree worshiper and it has this kind of Thor who is, we talk about Odin, sure. And I can't remember what we talked about on the show versus what we talked about in person, but we certainly talked about the interesting thing of like, although now we talk about Odin as a high god, and that may be the case, that by far the popular vote goes to Thor, right? And this fits more the kind of other Indo-European religions around, that the thunder god is going to be highly placed. And that, perhaps a written cult of the bardic counting of warrior tales elevates Odin to a different position, but that it's pretty hard to get rid of the fact that like everybody's worshiping Thor. So this oak being sacred to Thor, and living trees as well as images carved from wood for these northern gods. But Saint Boniface himself condemning the area, condemning the people of the area, and chopping down Thor's oak is something that always stuck in my mind, because there's always these when you go to Catholic school, you read a lot about these things, and just the image of the saint wielding an axe, and there's this famous one that always felt like a coloring book because it's like black and white etching, but it's Robinson's Little Lives of the Saints, which was highly popular in the 50s and 60s. So you see it kind of sitting around in the old churches. But what is it? Now that at that time, many of the Hessians brought under the Catholic faith and confirmed by the grace of the sevenfold Spirit received the laying on of hands. Others indeed, not yet strengthened soul, refused to accept entirely the lessons of the inviolate faith. Blah, 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 blah. With the advice and counsel of these last, the saint attempted in the place called Geismir, while the servants of God stood by his side, to fell a certain oak tree of extraordinary size, which is called by an old name of the pagans, the oak of Jupiter, which is really Thor. And then with the strength of his steadfast heart, he had cut the lower notch. There was present a great multitude of pagans who in their souls were earnestly cursing the enemy of their gods. But on the fourth side of the tree was notched only a little, so that the oak's vast bulk, driven by a blast from above, crashed to the ground, shivering its crown of branches as it fell, as if by gracious compensation the Most High, who it was also burst into 4 parts, and 4 trunks of huge size equal in length were seen, unwrought by the brethren who stood by. And at this sight, the pagans who before had cursed now, on the contrary, believed and blessed the Lord and put away their former reviling. So just little miracles of trees blowing up at one axe blow by St. Boniface.
Right. Breaking the idols of the pagans. Yeah, I'm fascinated by that because there's a stray line in Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft about various unbewitching practices. He says that neither hunters nor their dogs may be bewitched. They cleave an oaken branch, and both they and their dogs pass over it. And I'm interested in what's this combination of the power of the oak as a long-standing tree of protection and warding off illness, as well as ensuring potency and longevity, especially, versus like echoing the act of a Christian overlay or a response to that. Again, the idea of like shedding the blood of something, that there's a magic in the catastrophism of the breakage of something produces a breakage of something else. Speaking of phallic sigils of Elestor, aka earlier Ashtaroth, the Latin geeks might be interested to know, if they didn't already, that the name of the head of the penis is glans, right? Which is the Latin for acorn. So it's literally a phallic tree.
It's a mighty acorn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So magically, associations of oak.
I mean, I use it for my Jupiter stuff. That's my main Jupiter wand is oaken for reasons we've talked about. The longevity of fidelity as well, of things that are built to last, and therefore again not just stray fecundity of sowing wild oats, but of nurturing beneath your boughs.
It's interesting because it's so associated with Jupiter that it's hard to, it's almost like, what do you use it for? Your answer was literally Jupiter, not like a purpose. But Jupiter.
I hold it on Thursdays when I'm doing stuff on Thursdays. I use it for a bunch of.
What do you use it for? Thursday.
Yeah. Well, again, what time is it? Who's around? What are those things?
The answer is always showtime, Al.
Oh, I miss the subway.
At least that part of it. I think it's because of indigenous influence. I think the oak is as equally called tree of life in the United States as ash might be cited as Yggdrasil in this kind of way. But I know many people that will conflate the two anyway, and especially when I think of like a sacred tree is a sacred tree. When we're talking about oak being truth and majesty, like majesty as a quality, like as a magical action, is such an interesting thing. But with rulership, that kind of right to rule that we talked about with Ashtaroth. But there's interesting because there's literally a tree called the sacred oak in Pennsylvania. And it's in Ole Valley. I'm not going to pronounce that like a local, but it is a tree sacred to the Lenape, the Delaware Lenape. So it's considered to be like a world tree representative. In that way, there's also a legend that's told about how a beautiful woman that's like married to a powerful chief becomes ill, and all the tribe's medicine men are called in, and they administered medicines to no effect, and the chief's wife becomes weaker and sicker, and finally the chief takes her to the sacred oak and prays to the Great Spirit for his wife to be saved. And when he returned to camp, she was well again. And similarly, when they were threatened by war, the chief goes to the sacred oak and prays to the Great Spirit to give some guidance. And he gathers beads and blankets and goes to the enemy's camp and gives the gifts, and they broker a peace. So it's hard to put a lot of credence in some of these kind of like roadside, here's the Indian lore on the place. But there is that the tree is considered to be sacred for many people around, and Lenape are a huge group, right? That's who would be all the way up in my area in Hudson Valley, down through Delaware. But there have not been Lenape in my area since the 1700s because they were all kicked out or left. But the tree exists and it's visitable. Is a beautiful tree. I also think of the angel oak, which if anybody wants, like, I like visiting named trees. It's just a thing. So the angel oak is a southern live oak, and it's on Johns Island near Charleston in South Carolina. And it's about a 500-year-old oak. It's like, it's not 100, maybe like 75 feet tall at most. And the trunk is like, 30 feet around, but it produces a shade that covers like, I don't know, 17,000 or 18,000 square feet. Like it's just huge because it spreads. And live oaks are the ones that like part of their trunk goes back along the ground. And so it is not the oldest tree east of the Mississippi, which is a common claim, because there's, the bald cypress trees are far older, like 1,000 years older, but it is an extremely important tree. And there's, the Mr. Angel, Justice Angel, maybe. That's the estate that it was on. And the locals tell stories of, ghosts of former slaves appearing as angels in the tree. So it has a reputation of where people go to talk to their ancestors. But it is also another beautiful, beautiful sprawling tree. And I like it because it's a live oak, it looks like the trees I grew up. That what you're talking about, like the Tim Burton thing of like weird twisty branches that kind of go back to the ground and then come back up. And I remember at the school I went to, which was called Anokia, named for the woman who owned it, which is Anita, and oak trees. Like there were just so many oak trees. And there's a certain smell that I can remember to like the ground when it's covered with oak leaves. It's a very tactile smell, and like the little acorn caps that are hairy, and then that's where they stick on your fingers really well. But there was a beautiful example of a nurse tree. It was a fell oak. It was probably, I don't know, 40 feet, 50 feet long, that all of the tree itself was on its side with the roots exposed, but it had at least a dozen 20-foot oak trees, which were its branches, still growing up out of it. And that type of nurse tree is always interesting to me. There's a lot of beautiful magical energy around those trees that fall but keep growing, and often in more count than they were just as a single tree.
Yeah.
And you see that in live oaks a lot. It's called a live oak because it stays green. It doesn't shed its leaves.
Right.
So it stays covered in leaves all year long. It's usually in an environment that doesn't demand it shed its leaves anyway.
Right. But stalwart. We've mentioned before, just because I know it wasn't in Nokia, but it triggered a thing. We've talked before about how ash can be a specific tree, but it can also, and you also mentioned it briefly there as the world tree in a lot of traditions, but that it becomes a term just for trees in general. It's the
yes.
And I see, I have ended up finding a little bit of that in my ongoing experiments with angelical calls of prayers and magical speech acts based around the language called Enochian. There is no word for tree as far as I'm aware, but there is a word for oak, payet. And so like, yeah, I think about that in terms of like the oak is the Enochian stand-in for all trees, potentially.
I could, that's a lovely, make it so. Certainly there's evidence of many languages, that don't have names for collective nouns, or classes of nouns, like no word for family, no word for color, no word for mountain, no word for tree, no word for rock, but a name for every type of tree, a name for, multiple slopes on a mountain, each slope, each direction getting its own name, a name for every color, but not the word for color. And so I think it's interesting, this need to classify certainly has found its way into the Indo-European languages. So it's rare to see any Indo-European thing of like lacking a classifying noun. And certainly an agglutinating language like English, it's just, if it doesn't have the name, it'll create one and it's going to be based, Greek or Latin. But the notion of like every tree in Norway is either an ash or a rowan, right? Depending on who you talk to. And it's not that they can't, it's like what that, it's like ordering a Coke, and when they say, what kind of Coke do you want? You're like, I want a Sprite. Thanks. It does happen. So I don't know. I like that. And oak as a standard. What do you use oak for? When you don't know the specific word for something, and ascribe that magical intention to it. There is a lovely there's practicality to it, right? Of like it being so hard that it's going to withstand things. To make something out of oak, to carve a saint idol out of oak, not only is it going to last longer, it's also more difficult to carve. You need better tools to carve it. It is just, you have to start on softer woods. This is where you get your linden idols because they're easier to make, but it's just a balance between you can carve it, but if it drops, it's not necessarily going to get dented. Oak's going to dent the thing it drops on.
Right.
It's like a hardness scale factor.
Is that more of an investment to carve it? Yeah.
Yeah. I'm so drawn to the notion of, how oak is used so heavily for doorways and doors. Ash is also used very heavily for doors traditionally, but just the idea of a hardwood, especially for the beam that goes behind that latches the door shut. So that the oak is the thing that's supporting the ashen door, which is often used, just to kind of give it more strength. And the kind of understanding of how trees are used in our house, that we cut down trees and then erect trees that are then screwed and nailed together. And that there are tree-like things with branches that we can't even see in our very walls that are still upright in a grove, in a nematon in something that is truly lost some of its sacredness, unfortunately, in the modern parlance. But, the idea of the house as temple of the land and the connection to the sacred oak groves, and for many, the pine, and we should all be worshiping pine. That's like, it's 2x4s are most often pine. But I like this idea of the house as a sacred grove because we have used so much wood in constructing it, even if we hide it.
Yeah. Even if it's the skeleton of the house, it's still, the spine of it.
Yeah. In its connection to thundering and lightning and things like that, you don't often see, I've not seen much description to like searching oaks for lightning stones or thunderstones. But it is interesting that both this tying to the thunder gods, this idea of stones fallen from heaven, or the oak tree that attracts lightning but still lives. Especially a thunderstruck oak is a big thing, right? Like getting wood from that is an amazing materia. But the thunderstone itself, as far as a cultic object, has so much lore around it, and I find it's interesting because it's died off in modern parlance, except in certain like extant traditions. It's not something people kind of come back to as much. I did see at one point, I think it was last year or the year before, where Cody Borealis was trying to educate on Belamites, which is a beautiful British ascription to thunderstones. So Belamites and sometimes Ammonites were used as a thunderstone, or called a thunderstone. And Belamites are specifically it's the conical tube of a squid, a prehistoric squid. It was the fossil. And you see this in gem shops. They're black with like this weird conical gray thing across them. Well, people would carve out that conical gray bit, and it was shaped similarly to Neolithic axe heads that might be found, or simple stone tools that have been found throughout the years. Ancient axes often get called thunderstones, whether or not they were anywhere near lightning. And it's just the idea that the axe, the hammer that's thrown from heaven, the Thor's hammer, the different wedges that are thrown. So I found it beautiful to muse on Belamites as, this forgotten form of this fossilized form that is calling to the thunder gods. What does that mean? What are the fossils of thunder?
Yes, and this admixture of what's shaped by ancestors versus like the further ancestors of like, tracing things back to last universal common ancestor, right? What's formed by nature, and what's formed by nature using the hands of people who aren't around anymore.
Yeah, or like going back to the Adelok and seeing your ancestors there. It's just, there's something quite beautiful in this connection there. The tree as communal center, right? Or especially if you go into world tree, which is an interesting topic for a type of magic in the future. But okay, so thunderstones themselves, you also get more familiar with like the Orisha cult use of them as tokens for Shangoro, and the various forms of stones that fall from the sky. You also get so there you get lightning stones that were believed to have been found near where lightning struck. In the modern trade economy, things that are called Eduara or thunderstones coming out of Nigeria have a like obviously a silicate in them, or there's like a shininess to them. They look like a little granite rock. It's shaped roughly into it. The larger ones are shaped into a convenience, looking like a guitar pick often in shape, or perhaps elongated versions of those. You also get the heavily shaped ones, which are often made out of a different rock. And it's interesting, they're all being called Eduara and sacred in that way. But thunderstones throughout history have been very much worked by human hands to make the shape of an axe head. And you see a similar thing that in the Caribbean, where, the Orisha cult, as it goes to Cuba, uses prehistoric Taino axes and Arawak axe heads as thunderstones. It sees those as thunderstones. And so you get these very long, extended teardrop, I guess you could say, like a clown wearing a dunce cap, or like a Jack in the Box logo. I don't know how to describe it, but very long, elongated, teardrop shaped stones being called thunderstones, to the point where now in many botanicas you go, it's actually polished concrete. It's not even a rock anymore. And you can throw it if you clack them against each other. I remember this time where my godfather was going with me to a botanica, and he looked and he starts smacking them against each other. He goes, if they really no break, and the guy's like, please stop, for being respectful. But he's like, no, this no sirve. Eso no sirve. And like, just keep going through it. Like, this one works. Like, by this one, we destroyed like 5. And the owner comes over, he's like, please stop, sir. Like, I'll give that to you. Let's just come over here. But he was like, hey, we get for free. I was embarrassed, but I miss him every day. So yeah, what gets called a thunderstone, and there's also medicine associated with them. Like, I know that in Southeast Asian tradition, the things that are called thunderstones are used for intestinal distress, for especially appendicitis, boils, ulcers, that type of thing. There's just keeping a thunderstone will prevent fire from coming into your house. So honoring the lightning god in some way keeps it there. But interestingly, I guess it's the lightning doesn't strike twice thing, maybe. That like, if you're keeping the product of lightning, that, he's already exacted his vengeance. Because the other side of it is if you go, follow the kind of Shango cult idea that they would go to someone's house that was struck by lightning, they were being punished. We find the stones. Let's find the stones, even though their house burned down. Find the stones and distribute those as holy objects is an interesting progression, right? To take the objects from this.
Yeah, exactly. Like a combination of evidence of a meditation on let's not do this again, and also a kind of inoculation.
Yeah,
like taking a little part of the thing that has afflicted and using it as a protection against that affliction in the future.
I think it's the Quiche Maya that talk about a flint that falls from the sky and shatters into like several thousand pieces, and each piece becomes a god. So the gods themselves are made from thunderstone. And that often flint is associated with thunderstones or with firestones in general, because it's flint. You strike it with metal, it makes sparks.
Right. And can also be into nice cutting and grinding and
exactly. Arrowheads themselves refined from that and things like that.
The arrow being the other thing, a stone that falls from the earth, again, propelled by a branch.
And the Pueblos had flint societies, which were, weather witchcraft societies, and sometimes used for war, but it was trying to figure things out with flint. I also think, what is it, Pawnee? They have that there's a deity called Morning Star that gives flint to the people. Stone weapons in general. It also brings the point of like understanding older cosmologies, of understanding the stone as the sky as iron. And therefore, in addition to just the stones that are created when lightning strikes, but that meteorites themselves are pieces of the sky. And that is why they're iron. So, when something falls through, when an angel comes down, when serpents as lightning are traveling across, or dragons are fighting, whatever the mythology of the various places, which is all those exist in Europe. Just that the iron that falls is indeed evidence. It's a piece of the firmament.
Right. The cave roof of the vault of night.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And that I think there's something really beautiful about that too. So thunderstone is more often than not a meteorite, but it can be a meteorite, or it could be a fulgurite, which is what's actually created by lightning when it strikes silicate sand. So it makes a type of like fragile glass. You also get a difference. So fulgurites are often born in deserts, right? Because there's more sand. But you also get what the meteorites that were traded heavily in Europe in the early modern period were sandy meteorites from northern Africa. Again, because meteorites that fell in cities, that would be a different thing. The people would probably keep those meteorites. But meteorites themselves being worshipped is I think that we'll probably have to do that as a topic, because that covers everything from like Artemis of Ephesus to the Kaaba to just anything. So I guess meteorites is a beautiful rock to explore in the future. But to understand that, I think thunderstones can cover many things, from fossil to random stones that were near where lightning struck, to shaped weapons that symbolize the throwing of stone from the sky, stone thrower, right, that turns to Shango, to as well as it could be fulgurites, meteorites, or anything like that. I have an enormous man-made fulgurite. Well, not really man-made. It's made by something that was man-made, but it itself is not particularly man-made. So it's not made by lightning, but my uncle in Portland, I think the power line went down, and where it went down, it created glass in the sand in giant chunks. So the piece was originally like 4 feet long. And I have several pieces of it, because that broke, when they tried to transport it, it broke, because it's fragile. Fulgurites are fragile. Yeah. But I have a couple pieces of that. It's like, this is still fulgurite. It's just an artificially created one. But at the same time, it was an act of God that brought down the power line that then made the fulgurite. So fascinating.
How the insurance company going to classify it? Yeah.
Yeah. So stones that are smoothed a lot were found, that the ancient tools and things were often classified as angel weapons in the Middle Ages.
In heaven, right?
Yeah. So the idea and people giving each other heaven axes and angel axes and things like that they would find, which were well-worn stone tools. And that this was obviously the weapons of the angels from the ancient war. But the Thunderstones gave success in battle because of this association, safety on the sea because of the weather. You could help control it with that. Lightning wouldn't strike twice again. Security against thunder. And then also notably, it would ward off unpleasant dreams and curses.
The storms.
The storms of the mind. Exactly. There's a big thing too, I think, in some Latin American traditions with thunderstones or even wood that's been struck by lightning, is to rub it over the joints of the body to keep them from stiffening up. Like I know that there's definitely amulets that are said to be thunderstones that are sold for like curing arthritis, and like, rub this on yourself, when you first get up, when you're sitting at a table.
I think about that in terms of the stone has been enlivened in some way. Like it's been, Frankenstein's, like, he's alive, right? And you are adding that lifeness, or drawing the stoniness of the limb out.
Yeah. I know in Scandinavia, they can be anti-elf, like specifically elves, not dwarves, not.
Right. It feels like elf shot more widely, right?
Yeah. And that also, I think it was ancient Rome, that it was felt to cure the ill effects of rabies, meaning like if you put coral, which is, life blood, gorgon blood, and thunderstone, they would put it on dog collars to prevent dogs from going mad. And usually what that means is rabies.
Right.
So was believed to give a better life to the dog. Yeah, similarly, you see that tradition too with like putting an axe near the door, which is not a thunderstone, but you're still talking about the modern equivalent. Like axe blade up prevents against lightning, or a weapon near the door prevents against lightning. And I think it's just this interesting evolution from stone tools to metal tools.
Right, and the folding in of older ways and making them both more mythological. That that the tools of the ancestors of the land become evidence of angels or things like that.
Those of you that don't know, Dr. Al is literally a specialist in the passions. And it's a big thing. Like we were saying in the beginning, this is broad topics and we're already a long episode, but we're about to get longer. Because, so Al, dead magicians, Cummins, nay, passions.
Right. Right. So when I glossed my my doctoral thesis, which the title, which I thought was just meant to be a description, I was planning on giving it a very evocative title, but it ended up just being listed as a description of it, magical approaches to the passions in early modern Europe, with a concentration on 17th century England. But I generally glossed that as a doctorate in wizards and feelings, side Scorpio all the way. So let's dive into passion, the magic of passions, and passion magic, and magic about passions. The first thing to say is that we are talking about a thing that gets called emotionology, which I'll unpick if we want. But the important thing to bear in mind about looking at these different ways that the matters of the heart have been approached between a pre-modern and a modern split, and normally that's around emotion as a word is used way before that, and we'll talk about how it's the motions of the heart and the perturbations of the soul in some cases. But it doesn't come. But we get the more modern term coming in somewhere around 1700, 1750. Dr. Thomas Dixon has done a lot of good work on this. But we get labels like passions, actions, perturbations, affections, appetites, even, which aren't necessarily used interchangeably exactly, but we're certainly often dependent upon each other, as well as sometimes being different terms for similar or indeed identical kind of phenomena. And this is also partly complicated because of pre-modern notions of, a lack of Cartesian dualism between the mind and the body, and then the soul on top of that, and then also the spirit kind of weaving them all together, right? I love quoting, I think it's Bruce Smith talking about, this is how people think about those matters of the heart before Descartes convinces some European intellectuals, some to this day, that they can think without their bodies. So we get this phraseology of the passions of the mind and the affections of the soul. And they all are underpinned by considerations of perception, sense, and in a sense, reactivity. So even into the 18th century, early 18th century at least, like you've got philosophers like John Locke talking about the passion of the cue ball on the billiard ball, right? It's a matter of physics. It's that which moves, right? And that which moves through you, as well as the other crucial meaning, which is passio, which is to suffer. And so we have this idea that these perturbations, these imbalances are in some ways regarded as fundamentally challenging. And this is picked up big time by both the Stoics and then later a bunch of Christian thinkers about the psychomachia, the war of the good, rational Christian soul over your animal impulses. But you also get this notion that they are in some way tools of some kind, that they're not necessarily just imbalances, they're things that move you in a particular way. And that through understanding how we are moved, we can allow them to, we can bridle our passions. We don't defang our passionate demons. We simply keep them on tight leashes. And so one of the most reputable and quoted figures of Christian philosophy of the passions, at least in the early modern period, is St. Thomas Aquinas. How about that? And it's so reputable that he's referred to in texts on the passions as Thomism, or of the opinions of the Thomists, or even more familiar, simply Thomas. Thomas says so-and-so, and that it's always Aquinas. So there's a couple of notions there, right? There's the idea of humoral theory, not just being about the personality test of are you more of a Rose or a Dorothy or a Blanche or a Sophia, but also of humoral theory being based around the goodness and the efficacy of proper balance, of a eukrasia, of a good mix of these things. And so this idea of passions as imbalancing us connects by literal magical contagion the notions of the heart as the seat and the shaper of the humors and the passions in the body, along with like habituation and things like that, to looking at how we are not just unbalanced in the sense of I am solid and then something happens and I am upset about it, and upset, right? I am diseased by it, but also that you are ever balancing on the beach ball of your good health. And so in being moved, we can achieve a I never remember, is it centrifugal or centripetal force, right? That we are stable by our movement, ideally. So the big Thomists, the big contribution from Aquinas on passions in general and perceiving them from a worldview that treats magic as increasingly a natural thing that the universe does is a typology, is outlining 11 passions, but also dividing them into the concupiscible passions and the irascible passions. And so he says, which in English may be termed, the concupiscibles are coveting, desiring, or wishing kind of passions, and the irascible are angry, invading, or impugning tendencies. And so Aquinas lists 6 concupiscible passions: love, hatred, desire, horror, sometimes aversion, and joy and grief. And these are paired as the goody and the baddie, right? The white hat and the black hat. And then he gives 5 irascibles: hope and despair, which are paired, boldness and fear. And again, boldness is not just an action or a personality type. It's a passion. It's a feeling, more than a feeling. And then anger, boldness and fear, and then anger. And anger isn't given an opposite, but there are all sorts of ideas around how righteous anger and destructive wrath are kind of paired within the concept of anger. So we have this idea of these coveting passions that are for the movement of the sensitive soul itself, which requires some, again, Aquinas pulling in Aristotelian metaphysics of the soul, that there are these 3 faculties of the soul: the nutritive, which all living things that grow, like the plant soul, if you like; the sensitive, which all animals have, anything with a heart and a circulatory system is said to have passions. And again, there's a lot of reading passions across the species barrier, as one emotion historian puts it, of looking at like choler, like anger as expressed in the wolf, and that people are wolfish and wolves can be like angry people in various ways. So we have the idea of coveting passions are for moving the sensitive soul towards things that are good for us, ideally, as well as the lure of things that are not good for us that also pull us in. And then the invading passions are said to be for overcoming impediments to those movements. And this is all interestingly appointed by God. So we start to get this sense in this Thomist consideration that maybe the passions aren't all just, the whisperings of sexy Satan that we ask to get behind us. For the better execution whereof he hath armed all beasts, either with force, craft, or flight, to eschew all obstacles that may detain them from those things which they conceive as convenient. Wherefore the bull he hath imparted horns, to the boar his tusks, to the lion claws, to the hare his heels, to the fox craft, to men their hands and wit. And so you start to have this idea of thinking about the passions not just as being divided between the movement of the sensitive faculties of the soul towards that which it deems good or pleasurable or virtuous, depending on whether you're talking about Plato or Spinoza or various other people trying to work out how the soul relates to the world and the things in it and its passions, but also therefore what to do when you are confronted by things that need to be overcome in some way. And so it isn't just about what you want and don't want. There's some amazing depictions of eschewing or aversion as very much a do not want, which is its own kind of desire. I desire not this thing.
Hold on. I just want to point out that I've never considered that homophonic relation before of eschewing and eschew.
So, the egg shoe. Yeah.
I understand that passions give rise to our concepts of emotions, but how are they different?
Great question. Okay, so for a start, when we're thinking about,
it's not just old-fashioned emotions, really.
No,
I don't like it when things are talking about things like, it's just primitive psychology, right, or it's divination, or it's holistic therapy within a cultural context. So I want to make sure that I'm not be like, it's just emotions. It's not. It's something different.
No. So we have, for a start, we have this idea that passions are what happen to an inspirited, is a horrible term, but like mind, body, soul, spirit complex, right? They are fundamentally rooted in imbalance, and often, and in perception, as opposed to something that arises without stimuli. So they don't exist in and of themselves either. They're part of the worlding. I'd also say that passions are pretty explicitly tied up into humoral theory, into this idea of elemental cosmological building blocks of nature and natural magic and magical nature. That, yes, they describe constitution and personality, proclivities and ease of behavior and habit. But they're also based around this dynamic balancing act of shifting mixes of the influenced and the influencing. And that they also are kind of predicated on the idea of a kind of porous self, that we are not discrete from our environment. We are, in fact, navigating through these interconnected nodal webs of occult virtue. And that these are less manifest qualities, like we talk about like heat and cold when we're talking about like that kind of elementalism, but they're manifest actions. They're heating, they're cooling, they're wetting, they're drying. There's a thermodynamics at play here. And so they're very much rooted in the elementated moistures of the body, of the elemental triplicities of time as well as space. They're understood that, you can be, just as you can catch other people's nightmares, because the other crucial notion here is imagination and the image making faculties of the imagination, the field like quality of imagination that is forming image magic in the head and around you, that you can catch other people's nightmares, or that you can develop the very things that you've been misdiagnosed as supposedly having. We talk about it in terms of, many psychologists will talk about it in terms of power of suggestion. But this is very much based in a magical idea of how the heart works, which is that it's prosecuting this this grand interactive web of sympathies and antipathies, right? That Empedocles, when he's talking about that, before we start calling them sympathia and antipathia, it's love and strife, right? It's fundamentally passional, we would say. And so that leads very neatly to talking about, planetary humors and, aspects of the heart itself as what one 17th century passion theorist, Thomas Wright, talks about as the peculiar place where the passions are lodged, that the heart changes, receives an alteration. And so the spirits, the blood and other humors are agitated and moves. And there's even a quote from Galen, which also thankfully works in the English, where the heart is, as it were, the hearthstone of the source of the innate heat, or the sometimes called radical moisture as well, by which the animal is governed. And here we're back to that thing about how Descartes isn't just being a stoned armchair philosopher when he says the main difference between a live body and a dead body is that a live body is hot, right? I think we've talked about this before, that you are not hot because you're alive because you're hot.
Yes.
And so this fundamental thermodynamics of life itself, as well as all of its expressions. So the term emotions is used and comes up, well before the 18th century, but its meaning is a lot more tied to these motions of the sensitive faculties of the soul towards and away from things, as opposed to later models that are going to emerge in the 18th century, the pneumatic model, for instance, and even into, modern neurophilosophy and neuroscience. One of the main histories of the emotions and the passions and tempers, which is mostly about humoral theory. Noga Arica actually tries to do this grand tracing from very ancient Greek all the way up to 21st century neurochemistry, and argue that we're still talking about some kinds of moistures here, just in very different ways. So there are similarities. It's not an entirely alien thing, but I agree. Thank you. It's important that it's not just a what's that loyally phrased, distinction without a difference, right?
Yeah.
That Passio covers both these Stoic and Christianized elements of the war of the soul, of the afflictions of the world, as well as the impetus to be moved by things and to not just be pushed around, but to engage with the world more. One of the key things I come back to is the idea not just of material joy, of the joys of the body, of eating a lovely piece of cake or chocolate that you want, but that there's a notion of spiritual joy as well that nourishes the soul. And so there are these threads, just as I think love is a great example, as well as underlying sympathy itself, that love is, has a history of being seen as both incredibly ennobling and not just nice, but bringing, potentially sparking the best in us or moving us to be better. But it's also the maddening thing that wounds us and enfeebles us, right? So we get that whole gamut of things in this kind of approach to passions, these magical approaches to passions themselves.
A couple of things that makes me think of. One, I thank you for repeating that of the heat is what makes you alive. And I love the same examples from humoral theory with like Aztec humoral theory of, the fact of the exposure to the sun and the sun souls that give you is what is, you borrow some energy from the mother and her line, but exposure to the sun is what gives you independent heat. And therefore that bit of spark of life that's in you, which is because that will start to diminish over as you age, that elders are cold by their nature, and they literally are feeling more cold. They cannot, their circulation is not as good. They aren't as internally hot, that the youth are hot and that the elders are cold. And there's this play of hot and cold, specifically within indigenous humoral theory in Mesoamerica that is extremely specific. And it is looking at the heat as the progenitor, as evidence of the gods rubbing sticks together and creating a fire in the head, which is that's why you're alive. You're not alive, and then the heat comes, which is just a lovely distinction.
Yeah, and you also see that with the European models of humoral theory about like these are not just times of year; they're also like stages of life. And yes, old age is melancholy for a variety of ways. It is cooling, it is drying, it is a reflection of now is the stage of life where people aren't getting married or having kids or divorcing, but dying.
And it's also why people become infertile. There's less heat. Like all of those things start to become one as justifying, of course, because these are tested and true models for hundreds of years. There's a reason that they are thousands of years, these variant things that evolve. It also reminds me, are you familiar with the rasas, like aesthetic theory out of, I am not an expert in this, but I've explored it in voice class, amongst other things, but rasa means taste or impression. And there are 8, which gives rise to a 9th in most theories. Some classical text lists, anywhere from 6 to 8, but they are the extremes to which an actor or a performer in theater, or which includes dance and song and all these things, should find a way to experience within the piece, that it can be geared towards one of these. And the importance of understanding all of them is that these are both made up of humoral expressions, but they are also meant to, as they move the actor towards finding how the body expresses these things or the voice expresses these things, that it relies on this understanding of theater, which is a gift from the gods to man, right? That there's this understanding that rasa is produced from a combination of determinants, consequence, and transitory states. So there's like the 3 things that do it. I'm quoting that specifically. And that as far as the 8, as they're listed in summary, would be like the erotic, the comic, the pathetic, the furious, the heroic, the terrible, the odious, the marvelous. And then the last one, the 9th, is bliss or tranquility, which is not meant to be by itself. It is actually a combination of all other 8 at once. So the ability to feel and taste all things at once is bliss or tranquility.
The white light of the rainbow reassembled.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So there's something, there's beautiful quotes about rasa and what this is, but like, the enjoyment of rasa is like this bliss that comes from realizing one's identity within the highest Brahman, where it consists of repose in the bliss, which is the true nature of one's own self. That to experience the extremities of life is to find what bliss is, that you will not find enlightenment having not lived. So what is rasa? One quote is, it's an aesthetic response elicited by drama. It's not an emotion itself, but it derives from the emotion. And so it's this impression that we can categorize from that. And just the notion of its reliance on the theater has as its goal to empower aesthetic experience and to deliver rasa, to deliver impressions or tastes to the people who are witnessing it. And that is the origin of certain mudra, hand positions, arm positions, body alignments, eyes, all these things within classical Indian dance, which is of course contextualized to various Indian subcultures. But I think the understanding of these things of each, deities residing over each of them, but still at the same time, understanding them as uniquely human responses to something that we are witnessing. And that I also am struck in hearing you talk of, again, I'm sure I've considered it before and I've written the word many times, but to understand how important motion is to emotion, to be moved by something. And it brings me back to like discussions of the kingdom of the harp and Kimbanda, of being moved by music or attraction. That which moves you without physically touching you is the kingdom of the harp, of music, dance, seduction. So the Lira kingdom, lyre.
Not just, a bunch of bars, but like the spinning that happens there.
Yeah. And if you can't find that spinning through music and dance, you're going to try and find it through alcohol.
Right.
And escape. That's the thing, how beautiful it is to be inebriated and be with friends, how horrible it is to be drunk alone.
Yeah.
Friends and socialization make up for the rest of the way that the alcohol is trying to take you. You don't need the alcohol, but it can be a loosener of tightness, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And
social lubricant.
It's absolutely a social lubricant. It's absolutely talked about expressly as an aphrodisiac at various points. Yeah. See, you get the idea of like that which alters or lubricates or allows things to flow through us more or less naturally, in terms of like what we could call it like passion magics themselves, right? We get like what I might call natural aphrodisiacs, which are often some form of either they have a non-manifest quality of having a salubrious virtue, right? Of the horny goatweed stuff. You also have some natural aphrodisiacs that are considered to be kind of enmattered passion themselves. I think the hippomane is a great example of this, which I think we've talked about maybe in another episode. The little it's like an extra placenta that's attached to a foal's forehead when it's born, and the mother usually eats it. And so it is said that if you take that before the mother eats it, it is the mother's love for the foal enmattered. And so if you take it, she won't love the foal. But moreover, you can then dry it on a blackthorn usually, and it dries very hard and can be powdered pretty easily. And is one of
I know what I want for my birthday.
I'll pick some out. I had a friend whose dad had a couple colts and dried me one. I'll see if I can do that.
Yeah. There's it says in looking it up, it's new to me. Sea cow, lemur, and hippopotamus are often have the same thing, and occasionally such formation occurs on goats, sheep, and cows, ruminants in general, and pigs. So I'll look for the goats.
You get hippomane? Oh my God.
Yeah, exactly. And then, come on, even pigs for lust. Like that is, and goats for lust. Oh, that's some lusty love magic. So I want to say this because now I feel like we're going to have to like co-author an article here, bringing in the performance studies, because I'm really struck by passion magic, trying to make someone feel a passion to be moved by. And because Rasa is heavily analyzing theater, where you were trying through a performance to make an audience feel a specific rasa or a specific response. Yeah. And there's so much theory. I don't know why that excites me so much, because the theory should not be that exciting, but still there's something to this. I'm like, it is a passion magic that is directly theater as a tried true place for understanding ritual and magic is obviously where I'm like pounding my fist. I'm so excited. That is something that's like, that's my sweet spot. Right. But like, I think I want to explore performance theory through looking at passion magic in that way and rasa. Huh.
Yeah. Well, that's the core of, or part of the core of Peter and Carol Stern's notion of emotionology is looking at things that will later get called like emotion scripts, but the idea of the performance of emotion, of the experience and expression of emotionality, and how that differs in different places and peoples, the pastors of occulture, they do things differently there. And so this is absolutely performance stuff.
Well, I think of
a passion.
If you like, early modern acting is far more demonstrative and over the top and is almost comical by modern standards, right? Where we have since, post Stanislavski and post early 20th century revolutions in theater, brought in a realism that led to film realism as well.
Right.
And so, the difference of like the body, in theater, you have to still act with your body, and in film, you can act with your face, and there's differences there. But, the notion as we shift from, modern to postmodern, And this, because postmodernism, as far as theater, has more in common with classicism than it does with modernism, which is interesting. There's often, although postmodernism dismantles hierarchies, there's still a difference. And one of the things with an understanding in this is that the emotion portrayed is not necessarily the emotion received. So there's an understanding like in acting schools, where you study the theater. If you're trying to make someone cry, if you're trying to make yourself cry, there are many techniques for that, from beating yourself up emotionally, or I don't know, could try acting, and then it's much easier, as the famous words.
Right.
But for instance, coming from a physical theater background, you do the things that you do when you try not to cry, and your body will cry. So the tensing of the throat, the rapid breathing, the raising of the soft palate, the constant swallowing, those will bring a certain tension that will probably bring about crying faster than trying to quote unquote cry. Similitude, that if you want an audience to cry, you don't cry on stage. You fight crying, because the audience does not want to fight crying. And so that is what it is that you can draw out the tension of not crying on stage, of fighting back the tears, and you see the moisture and the tears are going down the cheek, but the person hasn't given it to right. It actually makes the audience weep, because it is you're moving them to feel what you are not allowing yourself to feel.
Because it's got to go somewhere, and rather than being a mirroring of the actor does something, so the audience starts doing it. It's not a monkey see, it's because the actor isn't doing it, but this thing has been evoked. It has to go somewhere.
Exactly. So this is why we like unrequited love, because it makes us feel love. But it's like, no, we want this couple we have to resolve. And you're like, we should to stop right before the emotional outpour, so that it actually makes the motion has to go somewhere. And the spirit has to possess somebody. And if it ain't going to possess you, and you're the one that called it, then it needs to go to somewhere else.
That's awesome. I was trying to steer it towards that sense of performance. But that makes so much more sense. You have summoned into the circle, and you're the one, the actor directs, right? In that sense,
Broad topic wise, I can link this to Via very easy, because although there are not standardized lists of order of geomantic figures as often as there are in Al Ramo and specifically Ifa, that the corresponding homoformity, same shaped, symbols of one vertical line repeated 4 times in a vertical column, which would be Ogbe or Ejiogbe. Ejiogbe actually means 2, because we're also remembering that when we're talking about Odu, you're talking about 2, a mirroring of itself. Right. And again, my caveats on Odu, this is very simplistic, and it's mainly just for discussion. And there are plenty of excellent sources on Odu out there, and it's a living tradition. So if you're really interested, find someone to study under. It's awesome. But Ejugbe is the first, and we codify it as numbers and say 8-8, but in the Dialogue system, the correspondence, but it is the first. It is the first of all 256 combinations. You get the 16 Megis first, the 16 twins. So the most pure, what we would say is like the 16 figures of geomancy, but doubled on themselves. And then the mating of those different, combined forms of those, which then form out the other, past the 256, the 240. But this is the first. And it has one of my favorite proverbs, which by some is held to be the first line of Ifa, but I'm not a Yoruba speaker. I'm someone who has great reverence for the Yoruba culture and the spirituality, but I am of the Cuban system. So, our things are codified in Spanish with Lucuñol or Lucumi. But the fact that it is bit by bit, we eat the head of the rat, or bit by bit, we eat the head of the fish. And this is an admonition to take your time with things that count. The cheek meat or the head meat on a fish or a rat is incredibly exceptionally flavored, but it's very tiny, and you have to take your time because it's very delicate. So similarly, the first verse of the codified wisdom of Ifa is take your time, bit by bit. It will all unfold if you just keep going, which speaks to the flow of many things. It makes me think of the the stories of the incarnation of Ella as human and the inability to form a human body at first, until there's this understanding that if I form a human body, I must teach. And so Orunmila takes on two disciples, Ashtaroth, and that wisdom is flowing out into the universe through the need to teach, through that kind of Thomasinian, like, I guess I've researched enough now I must write the primary of Summa Theologica to give to people to understand the basics, so that I can also train peers to have conversations with, which is a thing, right? Like, it's not, there's this divide that happens when you teach things that people are like, well, you just know so much. You're like, I don't need to know more than you. I would actually love to be your equal and we could go argue and have a beer over it.
Right.
or a cider. But it's one of the things that I've always fucking loved about Jake, is that I disagree with Jake Stratton Kent on so many things. And yet I will always count him as one of my favorite fucking people to talk to, because he gets excited when you disagree with him. And he's like, oh, really? Why? I'll buy the first round. And it's some of my favorite conversations with you and him in Boss Castle, of the pleasure of several of these events, of just, thank God. What a fucking fun time to have it be about a subject, not about ego, not about the devaluing of another's personal experience because it doesn't line up with your own, but rather, yes, keep telling me you don't like what I'm doing. Why don't you agree? And really diving into it is just pure fucking amazing punk attitude. And like, right, yeah. So shout out to Jake Stratton Kent, and showing how it should be done in that way of just talk. It's about learning and mutual advancement, which we get from testing out all our emotions and coming back to the enigma of bliss in the center, which we get from the experience of thundering, I suppose, makes it stronger.
Not just the meandering of the light, but the coming back of the light together, right? Yeah. Like in all those rarefied spectrum of the rainbow back into the white light again in a reverse Pink Floyd album, right? The is also this concept of the way of light, the course of the light in the darkness specifically. But yeah, it's also the path that you walk, and the road, and both what's on the way and what's in the way. So both like argumentation and also like the long walks on short tangents, right? Yeah. And that the road itself is also like something that we eat with our feet bit by bit, right? One foot in front of the other. Yeah.
It comes to mind that this podcast and the way that we speak is all just very Via. Because there's this challenge presented in Ogbe too, that, I'm oversimplifying, and to understand that Odu is a vast system of not just this kind of knowledge that is applicable to like solving problems for divination and counsel, but it also contains the medicine and the traditions and the customs and the codified essence of a culture. And so it's very hard that's just why it's important for me to say, like, I try very hard to not go into too much personal experience with Odu, because one, I'm a santero who's training, and I'm not authorized to speak on Odu in that way, nor are any of our listeners people that I'm agreed to teach. And there is always that problem of the one-sided conversation of the book, of which podcast is kind of a book, right? I'm talking this, in that you can't have the conversation with me to clarify what I said. And God knows I'm confusing enough. So I try and stick to very much published accounts, and published translations of Odu poetry, because they are actually poems that contain this. So it's all told in metaphor that is then talked about, and broken down. But the idea that Ogbe, think of it like a tightrope, that it is very good for leading you forward, and it is so easy to slip and fall. It is that thing of like, what, my visual here is like, if it's the tightrope, what do people crossing a tightrope use? Another long, strong thing that they use to literally cross up the wire to keep their balance.
Yes.
Because one little fall, either way, misplaced, you will fall. You can get to the other side that no one else can get to, but you must be careful, go slow, assess your situation. This is the sign of leadership. This is the sign where extreme knowledge can come forth, but it is not guaranteed. It is the whole white cloth is easily stained kind of proverb.
Yeah. It's the parallel here that seems relevant, and is in European Renaissance geomancy often framed a lot more like negatively and specifically, is that Via is often a figure which breaketh and spoileth all the goodness of the others, saving in demands of journeys and voyages, and to go from place to place, right? For which she is very good. So this idea of like, if you try and stay still on a tightrope and not move at all, you are very likely to fall off, because even the slightest movement. But again, that balance in a dynamic stability of putting one foot in front of the other. And if you try and the willow that bends as opposed to the oak that is destroyed by the coming of something in your way. Yeah.
I think also of its relationship to populace.
Right.
And long ago when I was looking at a lot of geomantic things, I was very much trying to look at Rommel and Muslim expressions of geomancy. But the understanding of the relationship of Via as the prophet and populace as the people, and this intrinsic difficulty, because the prophet can be his own downfall right away, always, right? Just say the wrong thing and it's gone. A prophet in their own house falls short. But both those figures are also lunar. Famously, like there's a lot of discrepancies in not a lot. There's a few other discrepancies for planetary inscriptions, but like,
yeah, I was reading recently about someone was talking about in a forum about populace being sometimes read as a mercurial figure in some Arabic forms of Rommel, and that making me the not that Mercury is only about crossroads, but like not just the crossroads as if you don't walk it, you are going to get hit by a car. That it's the field of potential for things to come from, and the connecting
it is
of the presence of absence.
Yeah, I think when I think of it in the mercurial way, that it becomes the difference between the moonlight, the full moon reflected on the water, where you see that long stream of light, versus ambient moonlight, where everything is brightened, and the relationship there, because this does become mercurial, because when we talk about the crowd, it's the Assassin's Creed model of like floating in and out of the crowd. You don't know where the blessing or the danger is coming from.
Yeah.
So it requires a certain awareness and a certain understanding that is very different, a certain amount of discipline and training that can then lead you to find great success, great wealth, great triumph in populace. But by its nature also is deceiving, because it's not as, the difference is you have almost no instructions and have to rely on self-discipline in a populist kind of world. And then you have all the instructions and must follow them to the T in a Via type of world. And the relationship between them, right? The fading of lights on, lights off, and like that type of, in a crowd, we're all equal. And in Via, there's no equality. Everybody is on different ladders trying to ascend. And there's this hierarchy that's enforced in Via, and similarly too reflected in these similar shaped Wuduifa.
I often explain Via as a figure of the moon that is about the moon's dynamism, the flow of the moon's spirits, even that like it's the way the moon can appear to be there, and then you'll turn away and have a conversation with someone, and suddenly it's somewhere completely different. And the quality of the moonlit path that is both brightly lit, but then also randomly obscured by clouds passing and being temporarily lost in a forest, and the populace is the stability of the moon's orbit, that we know predictably it will be somewhere. But this take on lots of rules versus no rules is interesting in terms of like the moon is the key of the stars for very specific elections. That Via seems to be that like, use all the rules to construct the exact, Israel Heibner and his exactitude and his stopwatches for better astrological talismans, versus populace, which is okay. That's the one instance of that particular election or that particular like magic of the moon you did, but like, how are you going to fold this into everyday life? How are you going to fold this into living about with a bunch of other people as well? How are you going to fold this into walking through the marketplace at midnight, haunted by all the possibilities of what's to come tomorrow and what came yesterday?
Yeah, I'm struck by this. Like, I'm getting too fixated on this notion of Via being the prophet. Well, it's also like ikra, right? This command to recite to Muhammad, peace be upon him, of it looking like a sword. Of the it looks like a sword. That first letter of ikra, and which is Via. So it's this command is there that a prophet speaking to the people for Via to enter into populace, is Via will go like it. there has to be such an internal compass there that continues, or Via will be absorbed by populace, right? It's the West that receives the East in if we're going to go back to Old fact, but, or the wet earth / moon that receives the sun, the night that receives the sun.
All right.
So this idea then of like, how does a prophet maintain that? They have to maintain their Via-ness by getting people to follow them. If the message is important, people have to follow them in the line of Via when they enter into populace, so that Via retains its Via-ness, as opposed to a prophet going into a crowd and trying to speak, where they will lose.
Right. We're thus spoke Zarathustra stuff, right? Of coming down from the mountain and trying to tell people that everything's God. And they're like, what are you selling? Via is the figure of pilgrimage. And then it's about also like, the greater pilgrimage of returning home, right? And the lessons that are learned along the way, are also the pilgrimage.
The little lessons along the way to revisit our mountain. So there's this famous Cuban interpretation of the stories about how this corresponding Odu Ejogbe is not the highest in rank in heaven, but that it's born out of a demand for hierarchy, and that there's this myth that's recounted by several authors, including Ochanilele. So I'll kind of vary on his version. Stuart, rest in peace. To understand that there was equality in heaven when specifically was Oshun, who is Acquisitio, I believe, correspondingly.
2-1-2-1.
And as a king, everybody was equal in heaven. And this actually works out very well, except that some people felt that they deserved more than other people. And so, or these spirits or gods decided this. And so they decided to stage a coup. And that coup is to put Ejogbe in power, because Ejogbe is a good leader. Like we can tell, he'll stand up. He's pretty, he's tall, whatever it is. And they stage a contest of tree chopping, physical prowess, and they give to the current leader. It's weird because we don't usually say the Odu name indoors or at night. But to Mr. Acquisitios in his Ifa guys, that, here's your tree, and they hand him a dull axe or a dull machete, and it's a hardwood tree. And to Ejogbe, they give a sharp axe or a sharp machete and a hollow tree, a tree that hollows out in the middle, Mujer sin corazón specifically. And that, of course, Ejogbe wins. And out of this is born the curse, it's called. So every story can have relationships with multiple containers, multiple Odu. And this one is still talking about the old king, Ofun. So it also, in his leaving by, he goes, you want to mark the inequality? I'll tell you how. And he gives them cowrie which are used as money. So now money is born, which is the marker of inequality. That, when everybody was sharing their resources, people had what they needed for their individual needs, but not more than that. And now into the rule of Ejogbe, the Highlander principle comes in, right? There can be only one.
Right.
And there's not enough room for everybody at the top of the ladder. And in order to maintain your place at the top of the ladder, you must bring people up to the rungs before you, which kind of explores the ladder principle in the Gurdjieffian and the way that Jetchi would understand it, of just, in order to ascend to the next rung, you have to bring somebody underneath you. You have to train them to what you know, which speaks to the place in the workforce or any other place. If you are unreplaceable, then you cannot be advanced.
You are promoted until you can't do any harm.
Yes. And so, oh God. So it becomes this thing of like, well, shit, if you don't take the time to teach someone what you know, then you yourself can't do new research.
Right.
Or in this model.
Yeah. It reminds me of Subcommandant Marcos of the Zapatistas talking about leadership as ruling by obeying.
Yeah.
You absolutely get this sense of like inversion with Via because of because of the I don't want to say the maths of it, because that's something that puts a lot of people off geomancy, but the way that, because it's 4 single dots, when they're added to another figure, how we mark not just this is a pattern, but this is what happens when this pattern meets this other pattern, in tracing these inertias of probability and potential into actuality, that it inverts things. That Karka 1221, the figure of like saturnine boundaries and restriction in some cases. When it meets Via, like it suddenly produces its inversion of conjunctio, that like it turns things inside out in some way. It has this quality to make you have to deal with the opposite force, right? That if you're falling off one way on the tightrope, you have to try and throw yourself the other way to achieve a dynamic stability.
Yeah. Not to cut it short on the Odu, but I actually realized, I know that I suggested someone in our first talk about this earlier in the week. Did you remember that he was on the list? Speaking of the unknown, because Dead Magician for the day.
Oh, I don't remember.
It's a surprise. I just think it's interesting because you tied into it in the way of like, okay, yes, this idea of Via entering into populace and this extreme in the balance. So like the road is a tying two extremes together. That's what it does by its nature. It invokes two, if not three. So the person I had originally suggested was Eliphas Levi, or Levi. Okay, so Alphonse Louis Constant, otherwise known as Eliphas Levi Zahid, is a esotericist, like one of the fathers of esotericism, we could say. A poet and author, a couple dozen books on magic, Kabbalah, alchemy, occultism. He was pursuing priesthood under the Catholics, but he left it at age 26. And by age 40, he was now publicly professing occult things and becoming a reputed ceremonial magician. So Eliphas Levi is a transliteration of his Alphonse Louis into Hebrew, his ceremonial magic, and because of the way he wrote his books, is also very. His books became very popular because they summarized great things in understandable, digestible chunks, and also because of his attraction to esoteric orders and having been Catholic, there's a heavy reliance on ceremonial magic as the foundation of occultism and esotericism. He's not necessarily, and which is starting a whole wave of understanding that's going to influence things like the Golden Dawn, but especially since he was in the lodge of the Grand Orient of France, which is, it originated continental masonry. And part of the beliefs in the Grand Orient of France is that they are the original, or that they promote the system where some things got lost and that they're doing the right thing. And one of the reasons that he left Freemasonry was because Freemasons are excommunicated by the Pope, and the Freemasons don't believe in tolerating Catholicism for that. And the main objection of the Catholic Church, by the way, to Freemasonry is not that there was a worship of the devil or anything like that. It's actually that Freemasonry allows for other interpretations of Christianity.
Right, you have a really kind of vague notion of not vague, but what's the word I'm looking for? Ecumenical notion, a grand architect, right? That could
exactly. So you're actually not necessarily encouraging, but you're encouraging by omission of a promotion of the Catholic Church. And that is what's hard, and not actually the pseudo Hebraic Christian magic that's going on in certain lodge degrees. But I'm sure if it wasn't that overt one, the church kind of, when it goes after something, tries to use the least offensive first, believe it or not. Like let's go for the thing that is easiest to say. And the reason I think Levi is so important for me personally, in addition to the influence he had upon 20th century occult revival, hugely, which is being bridged by the late 1800s to 1900s, the turn of the century Golden Dawn, and things going on, which just leads to this codification of through summary, which proposes weird universals, which he did himself. But he actually wrote his books from his first person perspective. He's also the creator, as far as we know, of the Baphomet image, which is something I would love to explore in the future, as for whether it's Beelzebub or Baphomet as a demon. But his popularity, also, and the books being published in the matter allowed spiritualism to take on some of the higher, quote unquote, high magic aspects of his philosophies and incorporate them into spiritism, which elevated spiritism from a kind of folk rebel perspective. And I think in sometimes a detriment, because Spiritism, which kind of got born on both sides of the Atlantic at the same time, although the American contributions are not as acknowledged until recently, that it arose out of Quakerism and Shaker faith. And this idea of just being still and waiting for God to speak to you. And that the conflation with, just say Levite principles of higher magic actually kind of took it away from the extremely pro-feminist and pro-abolitionist stance that early Spiritism took here. Because if everybody has a right to talk to God, then it questions all hierarchy. It questions man's superiority over woman and white superiority over black, which was a big thing. And all Spiritist enclaves, as far as I know, in the early, like the New York scene, were incredibly abolitionist and had people who were of mixed race and women of color even running things. So it's a very different field of operation. The minute you merge it with high occultism, some of that old high occultism has the high hierarchies slipping back in.
The very concept of like adepts, right, is not necessarily like invented by him, but the idea of you aren't just engaging with stuff or developing awarenesses or engagements. You are an adept who is training to become more than other people.
I think many people really liked him because he only told what his actual experiences were. He did not profess to be a Blavatsky and like, I'm in touch with the ascended great white masters living in a space palace above Tibet. He talked about the tarot. And he very much Agrippa his way, but through an honest like journaling, but an elevated way of doing so, of exploring concepts and trying to wrap his head around certain, what I'm sure was viewed as universal themes in magic. And of course through Judeo-Christian inherited mindset, which is hard to break out of. But I don't think his influence on magical thought in the occult revival of the 20th and 21st centuries it's undeniable. I think his impact on the Golden Dawn, which is a whole other topic, because it's amazing that the Golden Dawn has as much sway over the 21st century as it does when it was only around for a few years and had very few members and fell apart in scandal. Anyway, and then going from there to Crowley and moving that way. I believe that it was also good old Levi or Levi. I go back and forth on pronouncing the name. I'm sorry. To say that the averse or the upright and the reverse pentagram have different meanings. Right. And this just doesn't seem true universally before this point. But it is now embedded in the popular mental site, and it's quoted 21st century magic constantly in early Wicca of like, oh no, it definitely represents the horned god when it's upside down and it's matter over mind versus mind over matter. Whereas, upside pentagrams are in churches everywhere as symbols of the Christ light or the Star of Bethlehem. And it's very difficult. I do think even the Theosophical Society owes so much to Levi's kind of honing in and touching on certain topics and bringing everything to like, here's one book. Let read this book, and then you can read this next book.
I'm always struck by the fact that like, despite this notion of of high magic, of not being not being dragged down to deal with mere spirits upon the earth, but like seeking the divine truth and enlightenment and things that he still tries to summon Apollonius of Tyana, right? Yeah, he's still like, he's a dead magician who went after a dead magician. And his account is very typical of that thing you're saying in terms of like, he reports his experiences, and there's some wonderful phrases about like, I don't know whether like I'm not telling you what to believe about this. He talks about like the drunkenness of the imagination from the effects of the preparations of the perfumes, the mirrors, and the pentacles. And I just looked it up. Yeah, I do not explain the physical laws by which I saw and touched. I affirm solely that I did see and that I did touch, and that I saw clearly and distinctly, apart from dreaming. And this is sufficient to establish the real efficacy of magical ceremonies. For the rest, I regard the practice as destructive and dangerous. If it became habitual, neither moral nor physical health could be able to withstand it. And so within that one passage, you have all these different takes from ceremonial magic. I'm prepared to accept some psychology along with some spirits, which is again a very like pre-modern traditional take that like just because psychology is real doesn't mean spirits aren't, and vice versa. But also still being like, I did it. It was an experience, but like, you shouldn't do it. Like, there's still that like, moral and physical health kind of component to it. Yeah, a fascinating like admixture of these different influences and expectations.
You just made me think first off. Did you ever see The Seven Faces of Dr. Lao? It's an not old, but it's an old movie, 60s or I think early 60s. Tony Randall. I think it would be difficult to promote in a modern setting because Tony Randall plays Dr. Lao. He's playing an Asian man and kind of plays up the look and everything as was done commonly in that time period. But he also plays Merlin, Pan, Serpent, the Serpent in the Garden, Medusa, Apollonius of Tyana, and the Abominable Snowman. And so he plays Medusa, like it's him as Medusa. It's his face that men want to see and desire and everything. But the idea is that there's this sideshow that comes to town in a small Western town, and there's these exhibits, and he is each of them. And so everybody in like several citizens of the town have intimate, pivotal encounters with each of these entities. And Apollonius of Tyana, I just remember specifically. And it's probably in here because of the promotion of someone like you're reading Levy's books and the understanding that he tried to summon him. Because when you find out that the magician that you're reading tried to summon a specific person, it goes in your memory. Far more than just like, oh, here's an ancient figure. What would you like to do? Like, I want to call it the dude that other like person I read did. Pretty. And then also like, I think Levy does a very good job at like forming a proto-genealogy of magical theory in that you can clearly trace like Mesmer through to Saint Martin, through through to Levy and Reichenbach, and these ideas of the astral, because Levy's big things, will, imagination, and the astral light or the astral in general. And he's not making any of them up, but he's trying to understand these things as a foundational trinity of the occult.
Right. He's lots of ideas of what the astral is and isn't.
Yeah. And like looking at Paracelsus for his ideas of will and imagination, as well as synthesizing
Paracelsus's reports on gnomes or pygmies, salamanders, sylphs and undines. The prayers of the elementals are probably put together by Levi, but based off an awful lot of Paracelsus going and speaking to miners about what are the knocking spirits in the mines like, and so this flow between folk expressions and folk like wisdom and experience into like the hieratic consideration of elemental magic.
Bringing it back to passions, he has the warning: the operations of science, magical science, are not devoid of danger. Their result may be madness for those who are not established on the base of the supreme, absolute, and infallible reason. They may overexcite the nervous system, producing terrible and incurable diseases. Let those, therefore, who seek magic in the means to satisfy their passions pause in that deadly path where they will find nothing but death or madness. This is the significance of the vulgar tradition that the devil finished sooner or later by strangling the sorcerers.
Think of your soul, your immortal soul. Yeah.
Yes. If you are interested in the lineage of the genealogy of especially the 21st century occult revival, there are a couple essential Levy books.
Transcendental Magic and the Doctrine and Ritual thereof, right? Is that this translation? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I also, death-wise, I'm always fascinated with people who are disinterred and placed in a common grave or placed in an unmarked grave. And it's like, did he just not want people to steal his bones? Is this like a Shakespeare?
Right.
So, yeah, there's something there.
Or down a dirty conjurer in some ways.
Yeah. He died on the feast of St. Joan of Arc, which I look at. He was in fact May 31st. So thank you. That was a lovely 24th.
Yeah. Great to chew on some big, old, and important demons and the demonized heart and the light that breaks from it.
Al, for a vegetarian, that was a lot of meat for you to chew on.
The gristle of eating that which can be passed but never broken.
It's also to very much acknowledge riding the dopamine fix of caught upness and the projection forward that allows new vias to forge a path that we can fall up our damn tightrope any way we please now. God forbid this episode don't make it out on time. But to Lord Ashtar and the Ashtar command, the mercurial being that is Ashtaroth,
to pouring forth more fecund conversation in the future.
Yes, that was much more summarized and poetic. I hope, as academically minded as we are, and as much as I joked about just picking the saint because he's up to the end of January, I'm thrilled that we did pick him because it's there's been multiple connections, and it puts faith in our Sesame Streeting of even for convenience of big topics and finding connections. Because I think someone asked what the point of why we do what we do, and one is to hang out with each other, I imagine, and spur conversation for ourselves, as well as start conversations with people that come up to us, like what you said on that episode. Let's talk about it. Yes, please. In the spirit of it, always in the spirit of Jake. Argue at me all you want, as long as we're, in a pub somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Enough discourse to go around the table. Yeah.
Yeah. Patron of scholars, preservative of chastity. There's a lot of things there. And I expand that notion of chastity to mean just, keeping your Via-ness as you go into the world. Like, don't keep your course charted. If you're always traveling, then Via is always good. And, may we all draw a figure so damn well that it becomes like the Baphomet and it's just now given a life of its own.
The oak that pours forth acorns to stand stronger than it did.
That even when we are fell, may our children shoot towards the sun. May the offsprings of our discussions shoot towards new light and other various poetries of great and lesser import, including the little losses along the way.
Little losses along the way.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you. Stay tuned. Remember, find us on www.radiofreegolgotha.com or on the Folk Necromancy group on Facebook, or like our Facebook page. Find us on Twitter. We are trying to get better about announcing new things. There are more speakeasies to come. There are some other things we have planned that we won't announce lest we break our eggs before we even sit on them or before Al poops them out. So thank you all. Thank you, Al. Thank you, Ashtaroth. Tribunum.
Ashtaroth.
Supporting St. Steve.
Ashtaroth.
All right.
Take care, everyone.